Eddard Stark stood upon the battlements of the Red Keep on a winter-gray afternoon, the wind off Blackwater Bay tangling the wolf's head cloak draped over his broad shoulders. The city of King's Landing sprawled before him in an uneasy hush. Even though the day was young, torchlight flickered along the ramparts and in the windows of the tall, elegant towers. It was as if the city had begun to fear its own shadows, or the ghosts of all those who had died during the last war. Ned felt the weight of the new decree like a millstone around his neck. He had once believed in mercy, in justice that bent rather than broke. But he also believed in protecting his people at any cost. The realm had left him with no choice, or so he told himself in the lonely stillness of each sleepless night. He turned away from the view and descended the steps, flanked by a pair of guards in Stark livery. He was still not used to seeing so much gray and white in the Red Keep's corridors, where once the gold of House Baratheon or the crimson of House Lannister had dominated. How swiftly the realm had changed hands. Robert Baratheon was dead, taken down by a violent fever that consumed him during a hunt, an unlucky gash from a boar that grew infected. Joffrey, the boy once believed to be Robert's son, had vanished into the night not long after Ned confronted Cersei with the truth of his parentage. The city had been on the brink of war, but the last civil war had taught everyone a lesson. The realm could not endure another. Tywin Lannister had threatened an invasion. Renly and Stannis had each claimed the throne. Yet in the chaos, it was Eddard Stark, honorable, stoic, unyielding Eddard, who rose to the Iron Throne not as a man intoxicated by power, but as one forced into the seat for the sake of preserving order. Some whispered that it was the last wish of King Robert before he succumbed to fever. Others believed it was a coup orchestrated by northern lords to rid themselves of the southern houses once and for all. Still others suspected dark sorcery or Targaryen vengeance from beyond the grave. Whatever the rumor, the reality remained. Eddard Stark had assumed the throne, a crown of hammered steel and direwolf motifs resting atop his brow. Winter had come to King's Landing, not in the swirl of snow, but in a chill of command. In the early days, Ned had tried to be a fair and measured king. He offered pardons, strove for compromise, sought to quell the greed and ambitions of the High Lords through reason. But the realm was scarred by the cruelties that had sown themselves during the Targaryen madness, the rebellion, and the violent aftermath of Robert's reign. Assassinations, betrayals, and rebel plots twisted in the corridors of power until one by one, each great house defied the new king's demands to submit, to unify, to stand as one people. It began with House Lannister marching on Rosby, apparently to claim debts from local lords. It continued with a brazen letter from Lady Olenna Tyrell, who sought to have Margaery named queen. The Greyjoys turned the seas to chaos under the leadership of Balon's remaining kin. Doran Martell quietly readied Dorne for a war of vengeance. Riverrun was torn between loyalty to the crown and family alliances in the Westerlands. 1,000 petty disputes escalated, each fueled by the wounded pride and ambition of houses too large and proud to bend. For every letter Ned sent requesting peace, compromise, or loyalty, 3 more outrages arrived. Lord after lord paraded around King's Landing, all hoping to negotiate some advantage for themselves. Every demand rang in Ned's ears as the start of another war if he refused. He was forced to recall the lines from an old conversation with Robert, that the great houses of Westeros were each powerful enough to set the kingdom ablaze, and none were content with half a loaf when a whole loaf might be in reach. And Ned recalled the dire cost of constant war, the dead at the Trident, the bodies piling up from the Greyjoy rebellion, the toll upon the small folk. He could not let his realm be torn apart again. So the day came when Ned, in a moment of grim, resolute fury, gave a decree that changed the face of the 7 kingdoms. Every great house except House Stark was to be stripped of its lands and titles, effectively outlawed. The wording of the edict was careful, hammered out by Maester Wolkan, a young man the king had brought down from the north, and revised by Pycelle's replacement, Maester Argrave. It declared that the pride and repeated rebellions of all other great houses had proven them a threat to stability in the realm. Their sigils, seats, and privileges were revoked. Their members were offered mercy if they swore fealty to House Stark and relinquished their claims. but they would not retain lordship over the lands that had once been their birthright. They would, at best, become servants of the crown, minor lords without right of assembly or private armies. Any who resisted would be branded as traitors and hunted. And once the edict was read throughout the realm, Eddard Stark's name, once synonymous with ironclad honor, became a watchword for tyranny and fear in the minds of those families who dared call themselves great. It was an unthinkable measure. Yet the realm did not descend into immediate chaos. It seemed the shock of the decree was so staggering that, for a time, the southern lords who might have taken arms simply froze in disbelief. While war smoldered in the west, the north mobilized swiftly, uniting under the banner of the direwolf and the crown loyalists. Men who had cast their lot with Ned once he seized the throne, tightened their hold on King's Landing. Meanwhile, the smaller houses, fearful of being lumped in with the great houses or simply resigned to the idea that any strong authority was better than endless war, mostly complied. Men came to King's Landing, bowing stiffly, hearts brimming with resentment but hands tied by necessity. And so, for a moment there was quiet, a fearful, brittle quiet. Ned wore the crown like a chain of ice. Each day tested his resolve. He found no pleasure in delivering these judgments, in reassigning territories, in receiving the feigned reverence of lords who hated him. If anything, it ate at him. He would pace the length of the throne room at dawn, watching beams of dusty light creep through the high windows. He would sit upon the iron throne feeling the cold spikes at his back, hearing them whisper, "Are you king or headsman?" The question had become his nightly torment. But he told himself that he had done what was necessary. He had seen the realm sliding into another storm of blood. He had seen the ambitions of Highgarden, the cunning wrath of Casterly Rock, the simmering hatred of Dorne, and so many more. Without a single, overwhelming act of power, there would be no peace. Catelyn Stark never looked at him the same after the edict. She had once believed herself married to the most honorable man alive. And though she understood the necessity, she had lost her father, Hoster Tully, in the last war, and the Tully seat had been in disarray. She suspected this was a step from which Ned could never turn back. She walked the corridors with Sansa and Arya at her side, listening to the hush that fell when they passed. Servants hurried out of their way with bowed heads. The small council still existed, but it was almost unrecognizable. Renly had vanished, Stannis remained holed up at Dragonstone, proclaiming himself the rightful king, but with few men to press his claim. Lords loyal to the crown in name but terrified of Ned's next move now comprised the king's advisors. Varys, if he was still in the city, stayed well hidden. Littlefinger had disappeared after a short confrontation with Ned where he tried to pit him against the Lannisters yet again, only to find no audience for his plots. And so, in the hush of that uneasy peace, Ned began what he called the reorganization. Lands formerly held by the great houses would be parceled to loyal northern bannermen, to Riverland lords who proved their fealty, even to some of the Crownlands houses who had no history of rebellion or ambitious designs. The concept was to strip away the old feudal lines of power, create smaller, more manageable enclaves with direct loyalty to the crown. Let the direwolf banner be the only banner of real significance. It was, Ned reasoned, an extreme measure for an extreme time. The alternative was more bloodshed. He faced it with the same quiet stoicism he had shown in Winterfell when carrying out beheadings for desertion. Duty, honor, protect the realm, even if it meant forging a new cruelty. But whispers of war could not be silenced indefinitely. The Lannisters, led now by Tywin's heirs, Tyrion, who had managed to rally remnants of the Goldcloaks loyal to House Lannister's coin, and Jaime, who lived under the shame of the Kingslayer moniker, formed a secret alliance with the remnants of House Baratheon's supporters. Over in the Reach, Mace Tyrell had been arrested by outraged Crown loyalists, but his children escaped to gather supporters among the lesser Tyrell cousins and sworn bannermen. The Greyjoys, outraged by the forced dissolution of their seafaring pride, launched raids against the western coasts. Dorne burned with desire for vengeance against the man who had aided Robert's rebellion, against the man who now had the audacity to outlaw House Martell in all but name. Stannis, bitter but cunning, refused to accept Ned's overlordship and declared that the North had no claim upon the Iron Throne while a true Baratheon, himself, still lived. Ned watched it all unfold with a feeling of inevitability. From the highest parapet, it felt as though he was sitting on a cask of wildfire. His last hope was that the lesser lords, the knights, and the small folk would see the sense in following a single power rather than letting the realm tear itself apart. Indeed, many did side with House Stark, perhaps from fear more than love. Armies were mustered under the direwolf banner and dispatched to the Reach, to the Westerlands, to Dorne and the Stormlands. Always, they rode with new northern lords or proven loyalists in command, as though Ned sought to extinguish the old ways of feudal power in a single generational shift. In the Red Keep, the children of Ned Stark found themselves in a world that no longer felt like the songs of knights and gallant heroes. Sansa had once dreamt of a life in the South, married to a chivalrous lord, living in a castle full of gardens. The reality was that the smell of fear was in every hallway, and the eyes that stared at her father looked on him as if he were some monstrous usurper. Arya, meanwhile, found it all oppressive. The sorrowful glances, the quiet condemnation, the knowledge that people who had once admired her father now whispered that he was the biggest tyrant in recent history. She took her lessons in swordplay from a Braavosi swordsman that Ned had secretly hired, but she felt the tension even in the yard. Bran and Rickon were still at Winterfell under the watchful care of Robb, who had been named Warden of the North. The separation weighed on Catelyn's heart, and she found herself at odds with Ned more often than not. But the family remained outwardly united, presenting a cold, stoic face to the realm, an echo of Winterfell in the heart of the South. The day the first major rebellion truly sparked, the sky was heavy with gloom. A courier arrived bearing a sealed note from the Westerlands. It was smeared with blood, and the man delivering it collapsed on the steps of the throne room. When Ned read the contents, his frown deepened. The lesser houses loyal to House Lannister had formally declared him a false king and demanded restoration of their lands and rights. Jaime, calling himself the rightful lord of Casterly Rock, had mustered an army at the Gold Road, and Tyrion, cunning as ever, had brokered an uneasy truce with the Tyrell forces who had broken their patriarch out of captivity. They formed a joint force of formidable size. Rumors swirled that the Baratheon loyalists were soon to join. That evening, Ned convened what remained of his small council in the echoing hall. The Iron Throne loomed over them like a shadow of dark metal. Ned refused to sit in it while discussing matters of war. He stood with hands behind his back, gray eyes flickering from face to face. Maester Argrave was there, along with Ser Barristan Selmy, who had remained loyal to Ned upon witnessing the fracturing of the realm. A handful of loyal northern lords who had accompanied Ned from Winterfell flanked him. Lord Bolton, pale as a moonlit snowfall, Lord Manderly, towering and broad, and Lord Umber, the Greyjohn's cousin. "I have brought ruin upon the realm," Ned said quietly, weighing each word as if it might tip him into confession. "They will soon come to test my decree. Tell me, is there any chance of negotiation? Any chance for peace?" Ser Barristan lowered his eyes, sorrow etched in every crease of his weathered face. "I fear not, your grace. Lord Jaime Lannister has no interest in talk, only in restoring his house's pride. The Tyrells speak of overthrowing the tyranny. They claim you intend to starve the Reach by dividing it among loyal lords." Bolton's voice cut through the hush. "The great houses have proven time and again they will not be governed by reason. This is precisely why we took such drastic measures." His eyes were hooded, unreadable. "They must be crushed before they can band together. Let us ride out and prove the North's strength." Manderly gave a grave nod. "We have the armies. The North is loyal. I have men from White Harbor marching even now. Let them see that the direwolf will not yield." Ned closed his eyes briefly. "You speak truly. There is no choice now but war. If the great houses stand against us, we must meet them in the field." And so the command went out. The armies of House Stark marched under gray banners from the Crownlands and the North alike. Crown loyalists provided provisions and support. The Riverlands, still reeling from the fracturing of House Tully, remained uncertain, but many lesser lords there had quietly pledged fealty to the new king in exchange for keeping their holdings. 1,000 grudges simmered. Some men had served House Tully faithfully for generations and balked at seeing Riverrun stripped of its claim. Others welcomed the chance to free themselves from Tully overlordship. War, with all its shifting alliances and cunning betrayals, was afoot. On the day Ned left King's Landing to lead his host in the field, Catelyn stood upon the highest gallery of the Red Keep, gazing down at the columns of armored men passing through the gate. She saw the rippling gray of the wolf banners, the polished helms of knights sworn to House Stark. Here and there, she could even catch glimpses of the direwolf sigil painted upon battle standards that had once flown different colors. That slow transformation was striking. The realm was being molded, forcibly, into an extension of the North. Yet beneath her dread, a part of her was proud. Proud of Ned's resolve, proud of the power that now stood behind the name Stark. But then she remembered the blood it would cost. She prayed to the Seven to watch over Ned, to guide him back to the honorable man she had loved. The great host marched west. Ned rode at its head, silent, stern, each hoofbeat on the King's Road echoing in his mind like the inexorable ticking of some cosmic clock. War had come. He had tried to avoid it, yet he saw no other path. Winter is coming, he reminded himself. The realm cannot endure more chaos. This must be done. With him rode a personal guard of northern veterans, men who had bled with him in the Greyjoy Rebellion and the battles under Robert. Men who had known him as Lord of Winterfell, not just King of the Seven Kingdoms. As the vast columns passed out of the Crownlands and into the rolling hills of the Reach, the signs of war became evident. Smoke on the horizon from sacked villages, empty fields where small folk had fled. Scouts reported that a force of Tyrell bannermen had begun gathering near the Mander, intent on harassing the Stark columns. Ned split his army, sending Lord Bolton and a contingent south to deal with the threat while he continued west. The men parted ways, and Ned wondered if he was wise to trust Bolton, whose reputation was steeped in a cruel cunning. But these were the men he had, and these were the times they lived in. A fortnight later, messengers arrived with news that made Ned's blood run colder than any northern wind. Bolton had engaged the Tyrell bannermen on the plains near a small hamlet called Woodford Bridge. The Tyrells, outnumbered, had tried to surrender, but Bolton had refused to accept anything less than total capitulation. In the aftermath, the hamlet had been burned. Hundreds of small folk were slaughtered. The Tyrells retreated in disarray, cursing the name of Stark. Ned's stomach twisted as he read the letter detailing Bolton's victory. Had he not commanded his men to show mercy where possible? Had he not insisted that the small folk be spared? Yet Bolton had done what Bolton would do, ensuring that no Tyrell force remained to threaten them in that region. It was a strategic triumph, but a moral nightmare. News spread fast, carried on the tongues of terrified refugees. The king in the north was rumored to have unleashed a savage dog upon the Reach, a dog that knew no mercy. This was the cost of outlawing the great houses, the cost of forging a new order by force. Ned sensed the realm's hatred shifting, coalescing around him. Yet the war pressed on. Despite the terror in the Reach, Highgarden had not yet fallen. Loras Tyrell, the Knight of Flowers, had gathered the remnants of the Tyrell host, along with mercenaries funded by gold borrowed from the Iron Bank. But in a fateful clash along the Rose Road, the northern forces, commanded personally by Ned, met the Tyrell host. It was a brutal affair. The singing of steel, the screams of men and horses, the churned mud and blood made a mockery of the once peaceful countryside. Ned fought in the thick of it, his sword a steady arc of battered steel. He had always hated war, but in that moment he fought with a furious desperation. If he lost, everything he had done would be undone, and the realm would once again fall into fractious war. He could not fail, not now. The Tyrells broke that day. Ser Loras, grievously wounded by a Northman's spear, was dragged from the field by a handful of sworn swords. Many young knights who had idolized him perished, too proud or too certain of their skill. The survivors fled toward Highgarden, but Ned ordered a pursuit. Highgarden itself fell within the week, its gates opened by knights within who wanted no part of a siege they could not win. Marjorie Tyrell was captured. Mace Tyrell had been with the Lannisters, but his children, his lords, and his people were scattered or subjugated. Ned stationed a northern lord in Highgarden as custodian. He tried to show mercy, commanding that the Tyrell smallfolk be spared and the orchard fields protected from burning. Still, among the Reach lords the bitterness ran deep. Their great house had been outlawed, and now their seat had fallen. Resentment festered, thick as the vines on the castle walls. While the Reach was reeling, fresh tidings arrived. Jaime Lannister had marched east, skirmishing with Stark outriders and retaking several Crownlands towns from lightly garrisoned forces. In a bold stroke, he sought to cut off Ned's supply lines from the capital and trap him in the southern reaches. Ned, learning this, left a strong garrison at Highgarden and swept northward, cutting a path through the Stormlands. There, smaller houses saw the might of the direwolf. Some bent the knee outright, hoping to protect themselves. Others fought and died. Word reached Ned that Stannis Baratheon had tried to rally men in the Stormlands, but found fewer and fewer lords willing to risk open rebellion after hearing how swiftly the Tyrells and their bannermen were broken. Stannis retreated to Storm's End, which soon came under siege from a Stark-led force. The king in the North's bannermen ringed the ancient castle, prepared for a long encirclement if necessary. Meanwhile, Jaime Lannister pressed closer to King's Landing, drawing near the Blackwater. The city braced for a siege, but Ned, determined not to let the Lannister approach disrupt the realm's seat of power, turned from the Stormlands and forced a grueling march back toward the Crownlands. Each day hammered home the cost of his rule. Small folk lining the roads, gaunt with hunger, villages ravaged by foraging parties. War, he thought bitterly, always punishes those who have the least. And yet he pushed on, resolved that if Jaime took the city, the entire realm would plunge again into chaos. Outside King's Landing, under a sky heavy with storm clouds, the two armies clashed. Ned's forces, weary from the forced march, slammed into a Lannister host that had been emboldened by easy victories against weak garrisons. The banners of the Golden Lion rippled above thousands of helms. At the head of the Lannister cavalry rode Jaime himself, glittering like a storybook knight in polished gold armor. The clamor was deafening as the lines met. The narrow fields along the Blackwater churned with mud and blood. Ned sought Jaime in the fray. He found him mid-battle, swords crashing and men screaming around them. Jaime recognized Ned, pointing his gilded sword with a mocking salute. "So, the Wolf King deigns to fight like a man, not send his butchers," he roared over the clangor. A flicker of a grin, savage and reckless, played across his face. "Come then, let's finish this." They fought on foot, having both been unhorsed in the chaos. Jaime's skill was legendary. Ned had rarely seen a man move with such speed. Yet Ned was no novice, and the memory of each friend the Lannisters had harmed fed the cold fury in his veins. Their swords rang out again and again, steel scraping steel. Jaime darted in with a flurry of cuts and thrusts, pushing Ned's defenses to their limit. Ned caught the glint of torchlight on Jaime's blade. There was something triumphant in the Kingslayer's eyes, as though he believed he could change the fate of the realm with one stroke. But Ned had not survived Robert's rebellion by chance. He had studied the ways of famed knights. He recognized a pattern in Jaime's footwork and pivoted, deflecting the next strike and slamming his blade into Jaime's shield, driving the Lannister back. Around them, the battle churned, and the lion banners wavered, pressed hard by the Starks. Ser Barristan, leading a detachment of Crown loyalists, had hacked his way through the Lannister lines to reinforce Ned. Overwhelmed, the Lannister flank began to crumble. Jaime glanced around, realizing the tide of the fight was turning. With a snarl, he aimed a killing blow at Ned's side, but Ned twisted aside, and the golden sword scraped uselessly along his armor. Seeing an opening, Ned swung, his steel slamming into Jaime's sword arm. Jaime cried out, dropping the blade as blood poured from a deep gash. For a moment, Ned considered delivering the fatal blow, but a memory flickered. The boy Jaime once was, a lion cub bristling with skill and pride, undone by the madness of the Mad King. Murdering a helpless foe was not Ned's way, no matter the sins Jaime had committed. Still, the law was clear. Jaime was an outlawed knight of a bandhouse. Ned knew the realm would expect Jaime's head. But the man was at his mercy, and Ned felt the weight of that final choice. War roared around them. He could almost hear the pleas of the living, the dead, the unborn, each clamoring that this moment would define the fate of the kingdom. Ned's sword trembled in his hand. He drew it back, then slammed the pommel into Jaime's jaw instead of slicing his throat. Jaime collapsed unconscious, sprawling in the mud, golden armor stained with crimson. Ned summoned 2 nearby guards. "Bind him. He's our prisoner," he ordered, his voice cracking. "He will face judgment." The men nodded, dragging Jaime's limp form away as the fighting raged. From that moment, the Lannister host broke. Many surrendered, others fled. The unthinkable had happened. The Kingslayer bested and captured. The banners of the Golden Lion retreated from the field, leaving behind hundreds of corpses. King's Landing was safe for now. When Ned returned to the Red Keep victorious, the cheers of the city rang hollow in his ears. The small folk had grown accustomed to celebrating any victory by whoever protected them that month. Some called Ned a savior for repelling the Lannisters. Others cursed him as a tyrant, the man who had cast down so many ancient houses. But none dared to do so openly in the city. He marched Jaime Lannister through the gates in chains. Scattered storms had begun to blot out the sun, as though the very sky weighed the moral cost of these acts. Exhausted, Ned addressed his council. "Jaime Lannister is my prisoner. He shall be tried for his crimes. I will not shed more blood than necessary, but the law is the law." The council members, many with eyes downcast, did not protest. They knew that House Lannister was outlawed and that Jaime's fate was likely sealed. Tyrion was still at large, rumored to be hiding in some corner of the realm, plotting vengeance. Tywin, if he was alive at all, was rumored to have taken ill or was in hiding after the string of defeats. A few believed Tywin had passed away, leaving a vacuum in the west. In any event, the Lannister threat seemed momentarily contained. But what of the others? Even as the northern host settled into King's Landing for rest, new tidings arrived that the Ironborn raids had grown more brazen along the western coasts. And in Dorne, Prince Doran had been replaced by a rumored alliance of Oberyn's followers who thirsted for retribution. Stannis remained at Storm's End, still unbroken. The entire realm, from the neck to the sandy dunes of Dorne, felt like a chain in which every link was cracking under relentless tension. The uprooting of the great houses, once meant to unify Westeros, had instead cast it into a new state of war. Late one night, Ned stood on a balcony overlooking the torchlit courtyard where his men were training by moonlight. Catelyn stepped beside him, silent for a moment. She placed a hand on his shoulder, feeling the hard lines of muscle there, the tension that seemed to have shaped him anew. She asked, softly, "Do you still believe we've done the right thing, Ned?" He exhaled. "I ask myself that every waking hour, Cat. All I ever wanted was peace for our family, for the realm, to end the feuding and bloodshed. The great houses, they were tearing the realm apart. I believed if we stripped them of power and forced them to kneel, we might avoid countless more wars. And do you see peace?" She pressed, her voice trembling. "We have war on every front. The people are starving, villages burn, good men die. The hatred they bear for us grows." Ned's hand clenched the balcony's stone railing. "I see no peace, only more blood, more reasons for them to hate. But it's too late to turn back. If we restore these houses, the war continues anew. If we continue fighting them, more of our men die. Yet if I do nothing, all we've done is forfeit. Could I stomach that? Could I dishonor the men who died under my command?" Catelyn's gaze drifted over the courtyard. "Honor might be a heavier burden than we knew," she said, tears in her eyes. She thought of her father's old words, of how the Tully words, family, duty, honor, had guided her once. Now she was tied to the direwolf, to a man who was beloved and feared and hated all at once. She slipped her hand away from his shoulder. "You must know, if we continue down this path, we may never see the realm at peace in our lifetimes. The houses will not forget this." Ned nodded. He could not deny it. "The seeds of hatred we sow today may haunt our children." A great weariness pressed upon him. But what is the alternative? In that silent moment, neither had an answer. At dawn, Ned met with his war council again. He laid out the strategy: to press westward and subdue the Ironborn in the Westerlands while also keeping pressure on Storm's End. Meanwhile, they would send envoys to Dorne, offering terms if Dorne would renounce the Martell claim. "We do not seek to burn Dorne," Ned said, "but we cannot allow another great house to rise. Let them come under the Direwolf banner, or prepare for war." His lords nodded, some with grim satisfaction, others with weary acceptance. Preparations began immediately. Bolton departed to quell further Reach revolts. Manderley gathered a fleet to sail around Dorne's southern coast. Ravens flitted from the Red Keep to every corner of Westeros, carrying messages of the king's will. Yet behind every message lay the question: would men obey, or would they resist? Ned felt certain that more battles were inevitable. The only question was when and where. The trial of Jaime Lannister was set within the Great Hall of the Red Keep. Word spread quickly, and a throng gathered in the streets outside, eager for a glimpse. Most had never liked the Lannisters, who were rumored to have bled the realm dry for years under their cunning and gold. But they also did not love the notion of the Wolf King's relentless crackdown. Some wanted Jaime's head, calling him the Kingslayer. Others whispered that he should have killed Ned on the field to end this tyranny. The city crackled with tension. Ned presided, clad in the regal gray and white of House Stark. The Iron Throne loomed behind him, and torchlight gleamed off the black iron swords. Jaime, shackled, stood before him. His sword arm was in a sling, and his eyes flashed with a mixture of defiance and resignation. The hall was silent as Ned read out the charges: treason against the crown, attacking the king's forces, raising an outlawed banner, and a lifetime of rumored crimes that included the murder of King Aerys, though many considered that a public service rather than a crime. Jaime's lips curled at that. As the formalities droned on, Jaime cut in with a bitter laugh. "Do what you must, Stark. We both know there's no justice to be had here. You took the throne with your rebellions and your precious honor, then declared all other houses outlaws? This is not justice. This is your fear speaking, your fear of the realm you cannot control." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ned stared at Jaime, sorrow flickering in his eyes. It was not fear, it was necessity. You and yours would have burned the realm to ashes for your pride. Jaime shook his head. You think you can prevent the realm from burning by holding all the tinder in your own hands? You've simply lit the biggest fire of all. Starks fancy themselves righteous, but you'll see how the rest of the realm judges you in the end. Ned felt his grip on his composure slip. Jaime's words hit close to a truth Ned could not fully deny. But the hall awaited his verdict, and he reminded himself that duty required him to see this through. "The realm has no place for House Lannister," he pronounced, voice carrying across the crowd. "Jaime Lannister, you stand guilty of treason and rebellion, of raising arms against your rightful king. The sentence is death." An uproar burst from the onlookers. Some cheered, others jeered. Jaime stood pale but proud. "A fitting end," he spat, "for a realm that lost all sense. Farewell, Stark." Eddard Stark closed his eyes for a moment, then gave a curt nod to the executioner, this time not Ser Island Payne, but a northern man loyal to the crown. Ned had always believed that the one who passes the sentence should swing the sword, but that tradition had grown unwieldy in King's Landing, and it was clear that carrying out the beheadings of so many personally was too great a burden. The axe fell. The Kingslayer's head rolled from the block. Silence descended in the hall, broken only by the distant drone of the city outside, unaware in that moment that yet another chapter in the realm's tragedy had concluded. Word spread quickly. Jaime Lannister was dead, the golden lion head severed from its body. House Lannister was effectively leaderless. Tyrion, if still alive, was their only scion of note. Across Westeros, celebrations and curses rang out in equal measure. Some saw it as justice. Others saw it as a sign that the Wolf King would not relent until all opposition was exterminated. The pot of resentment and fear boiled. While the city still buzzed with the news, Ned assembled his lords for the next phase of the campaign. He would personally lead a host west to bring the Ironborn to heel and secure what was left of Lannister lands. The Greyjoys, led by Victarion and Asha, had seized key port towns along the coast, looting them in the name of the drowned god and to avenge the outlawing of their house. If left unchecked, they could carve out a new pirate kingdom. Ned had no interest in letting that happen. Before leaving, Ned walked the walls of King's Landing with Arya. She had begged to come along to see the world, to fight, but he insisted she remain in the capital for her safety. A compromise had been that she could walk with him before his departure. Arya's eyes darted about, taking in the distant rooftops, the ships in Blackwater Bay, the uneasy hush. "It doesn't feel like we're saving anyone, Father," she said. "The city's so tense. I see no joy in the people's faces." Ned sighed. Arya's candor often cut to the heart of things. "I know," he said softly. "War is never a joy for the common folk. It's a horror we can't seem to escape." She frowned, tugging at the hilt of the small sword strapped to her belt. "Then why keep going? Why not just stop?" He turned to her, considering how to explain. "If we stop now, all the houses we've weakened will rise up again in vengeance. The war would be longer, bloodier, with no end in sight. Sometimes a bitter action is needed to uproot an old rot. At least that's what I've told myself. But I promise you, Arya, I will not give up on finding a true peace once these rebellions end." She looked away, unconvinced. "I heard people calling you the Wolf King, the Northern Tyrant. But I know you, Father. I hope you can still be you in the end." Ned placed a hand on her head gently. "I pray for that too, child." A few days later, the main Stark host departed. Through dusty roads and scorching summer heat, they marched toward the Westerlands. Word arrived that Robb Stark had kept the North peaceful, with no serious resistance from any local lords. House Stark's centuries of leadership in the North made that region the most stable under the new rule. The deeper Ned moved into the Westerlands, the more he saw the brutal aftermath of Greyjoy raids. Burned-out villages, fields salted with blood, survivors huddled in blackened ruins. There were also pockets of Lannister loyalists who greeted the Stark army with hostility. Yet, in the face of Ned's superior numbers, most grudgingly acquiesced. When Ned reached Lannisport, he found the harbor black with iron longships. The Greyjoy banner, a golden kraken, flew from captured towers. The cunning seaborne raiders had taken advantage of House Lannister's downfall to plunder their cities. They had grown bold, sacking caravans headed in and out of the port. Survivors wept at the sight of Ned's army, torn between fear of the Wolf King and desperation for any help. Ned set up his camp a few miles outside the city. Scouts reported that the Ironborn, commanded by Asha Greyjoy, had a strong foothold in the harbor but fewer numbers on land. The local Lannister troops who might have contested them had been scattered during the final attempts to salvage their house's fortunes. So Ned planned a two-pronged assault, a land attack to drive the Ironborn from the city's walls and a naval incursion by the newly rallied Crown fleet that had been trailing behind his host. Lord Manderley, arriving with White Harbor ships, formed the backbone of that operation. At dawn, the assault began. The thunder of catapults and the crash of waves filled the air. Ned's men hurled ropes and grapnels over the city walls, clambering up amid showers of arrows. Ironborn reavers met them atop the battlements, axes and cutlasses gleaming in the rising sun. Blood slicked the stones. Men tumbled from the walls to their deaths. On the sea, Manderley's ships closed on the Iron Fleet, unleashing ballista bolts that splintered hulls. Black smoke rose where tar-soaked missiles struck decks, turning ships into blazing pyres. Yet the Ironborn fought back fiercely, boarding loyalist ships with savage cries of, "What is dead may never die." Chaos reigned in the harbor. Within the walls, Ned led a contingent through a breach opened by battering rams. He advanced slowly, sword in hand, trusting in his armor to deflect the worst of the Ironborn's savage blows. Time and again, he remembered the last time he had fought the Greyjoys during their rebellion. He had seen children pressed into the Ironborn ranks, forced to fight or die. He had seen battered fisherfolk turned into savage raiders. That memory did not temper his steel now, but it weighed on him. How many times must the same war be fought? How many times must the realm be taught the same lessons? Asha Greyjoy appeared amid the swirling chaos, leading a charge of Ironborn reavers. She wore hardened leather armor studded with bits of metal and carried a wickedly curved axe. She met Ned's eyes across the churned street, a scornful laugh on her lips. "You think you can banish every house that defies you, Stark?" she shouted, voice carrying over the din. "We're the Ironborn. No man can outlaw the sea." Then she and her men lunged. Ned felt the clash jolt up his arm. Asha's axe hammered at his shield. He responded with a quick slash that sliced her shoulder guard. She hissed but danced back, fighting with a fluid, feral grace. Around them, northern swords clashed with Ironborn axes, each side locked in a deadly churn of combat. Blood spattered the cobblestones. Asha darted in again, her axe hooking Ned's shield and wrenching it aside. He felt the jar of impact race up his arm and came face to face with her fierce, gray-eyed stare. "You fight for a drowned cause," Ned said, breath ragged. Asha snarled. "Better drowned than broken under your tyranny." She twisted her axe, trying to disarm him, but Ned brought his sword up, forcing her back. Another northern soldier lunged in from the side, and though Asha tried to fend him off, he caught her in the thigh with a spear point. She staggered, cursing. Ned could have delivered a killing strike, but something stayed his hand again. He remembered her father, Balon, and how the Ironborn had lost their independence once before. Perhaps there was a chance to end this differently, but the swirl of battle took the decision from him. An arrow from a Lannister archer, ironically enough, whistled out of the chaos and struck Asha in the side. She fell to one knee, blood bubbling at her lips. Her eyes flashed hatred and defiance, but she could no longer stand. The fight raged on around them. Ned signaled for a few men to seize her, then pressed forward. The Ironborn's morale wavered once they saw Asha fall. From the city walls, a horn blew. Manderly's ships had seized control of the harbor, and the Ironborn fleet was burning. Those Ironborn who could still fight withdrew to the ships that were afloat, but many found their paths cut off, trapped in the city. By midday, Lannisport was secured, the Kraken banners ripped down or set aflame, replaced by the direwolf. The battered survivors among the Ironborn either surrendered or fled on whatever ships they could salvage. Ned stood near the main square, breathing hard. His men cheered the victory as they hoisted the Stark banner over the last Ironborn holdout. But the sight of corpses strewn in the streets, of civilians cowering in the ruins, dampened any triumph in Ned's heart. Asha lay on a pallet, her wounds bandaged by the northern field surgeons, though it was unclear if she would survive. Ned ordered her treated as a prisoner of war, not to be harmed further. "She will stand judgment like any other outlaw," he declared. It seemed the entire realm was drowning in judgments and punishments. With Lannisport under Stark control, the remainder of the campaign in the Westerlands proceeded. The seat of Casterly Rock had been largely abandoned. Tyrion was nowhere to be found. A skeleton crew of old household guards still held out in the deeper halls, but they surrendered when Ned's forces arrived. The famed gold mines were sealed off by collapse or sabotage, leaving only echoes of the once glittering domain of House Lannister. Ned assigned a northern castellan to hold the rock and enforce the new laws. The realm now had the Westerlands, the Crownlands, the Reach, the Stormlands partially subdued, and the North firmly in control. But Dorne stood aloof, and though Stannis was besieged at Storm's End, he still held out, refusing to yield. From what Ned could glean, Dorne was forging alliances with exiled Targaryens across the sea. Rumors claimed that Daenerys Targaryen had hatched dragons and might one day return to Westeros. Rumors also whispered that Oberyn's bannermen had sent envoys to Pentos or Volantis seeking Sellsword companies. If that were true, Ned feared a new war front might open at any moment. As Ned's men settled into their new control over the Westerlands, news arrived from King's Landing. The city had experienced riots due to food shortages. Winter was not yet upon them in full, but the disruption of trade caused by constant warfare had driven up prices, leaving commoners hungry and resentful. The small council had used the royal granaries to alleviate some suffering, but the mood in the streets was tense. Some cried out that the Wolf King had more interest in subduing rebellious lords than feeding the capital. Others said they'd rather starve than see House Stark dethrone every other great house. Ned rubbed his temples, reading the reports in the flickering light of a camp lantern. Each line spelled out the fragile hold he had on the realm, the cost of trying to rule by force what once was ruled by a delicate balance of feudal alliances. He could not fault the small folk for their anger. In a sense, this was the outcome of the old feuds never being truly put to rest, but hammered into a new shape under his iron decree. If he tightened his grip, the realm might shatter. If he loosened it, the realm might tear itself apart in vengeance. For a moment, Eddard Stark understood the burdens that had broken so many kings before him. Once he believed in the old, simple code: keep your word, protect the weak, serve with honor. Now, his day-to-day existence was a maze of harsh decisions, each with dire consequences. He had lost count of how many heads had fallen under his rule. He felt each of them, an invisible legion behind him, walking in step with every choice. There were times he almost wished Robert's boar had killed him instead, that he would never have had to claim the Iron Throne. Yet he pushed away such thoughts. He had a duty to his family, his men, and the realm. King he was, so king he would be. The next urgent matter was Storm's End. Stannis had refused all entreaties, all offers of leniency. He declared himself the rightful king, uncowed by the Wolf King's decrees. The siege dragged on. Storm's End was notoriously hard to breach. Ned recalled how, in Robert's rebellion, Stannis had held it for months against the Tyrell host. Eventually, it took Davos Seaworth smuggling onions and salted fish to keep the garrison alive. Now, the roles were reversed. The Crown's men besieged it, but Stannis showed no sign of surrender. The houses around the Stormlands, many formerly loyal to Baratheon, were in disarray, uncertain who to follow. Some had declared neutrality, while others had been forcibly subdued. Yet Stannis remained defiant, apparently well-provisioned for a long stand. Ned realized that unless Storm's End fell or yielded, the war could never be said to be over. The entire impetus behind his decree was to unify the realm under House Stark, allowing no great house to remain that might challenge the throne again. Stannis's open defiance was a direct challenge. So Ned marched south with his host, leaving sufficient garrisons behind to hold Lannisport and Casterly Rock. The journey to the Stormlands was marked by the usual cycle of gloom. Ravaged villages, fields turned to dust under the boots of armies, sullen or fearful faces of the small folk. By the time Ned's bannered columns reached Storm's End, thunderheads loomed over the horizon, as if nature itself recognized the tension. The ancient fortress rose above the sea, its towering walls an imposing silhouette. Beneath its battlements, the Crown's besieging forces camped in muddy siege lines, catapults spaced at intervals, ramshackle barriers half-wrecked by previous sorties. Ned was greeted by the siege commander, a grim-faced northern knight who reported that Stannis launched raids by night, burning siege engines and killing supplies. The Crown's men had lost many in the attempts to storm the castle. Ned walked the perimeter, surveying the battered ground. The catapults had been flinging stones at the walls, but Storm's End was built to endure. The ancient masonry showed only superficial damage. Ned frowned. Another prolonged siege might break the men's morale, not Stannis's. Or worse, it might break King's Landing if the war dragged on. He ordered more engines built, but the thunderstorm that erupted the following day hindered construction, turning the ground into a bog. Sleep was difficult. The night rains pounded the tents, and lightning illuminated the castle's formidable walls. Ned found himself haunted by the memory of Stannis' stern face, always overshadowed by Robert's bravado. Now that face remained inside Storm's End, refusing to kneel. After days of fruitless bombardment, Ned rode forward under a parley banner, intending to speak with Stannis at the gate. He approached with Ser Barristan, flanked by a dozen guards. The heavy gates of the fortress parted just enough to admit a single figure. Stannis himself, clad in dull plate, as rigid as the fortress he commanded. They faced each other in the torrential rain. Stannis's voice cut through the storm. "You come to beg my surrender, Stark? I won't yield my rightful throne to a usurper." Ned gazed at him, water dripping from his hair. "You know the truth of Joffrey and the others. You know Robert entrusted me with the realm's safety." Stannis's expression was flinty. "Robert was a fool at the end. He let you gull him. I am his brother, the rightful heir, not you. I will not bend." His glare held an old bitterness, years in the making, bitterness at being overshadowed, at being denied recognition. Ned took a slow breath. "I do not deny your claim under normal laws, but the realm was in chaos, Stannis. You had neither the support nor the means to hold it together. I made a choice to prevent further bloodshed." Stannis barked a humorless laugh. "Further bloodshed? You fool. You've created more bloodshed than any king since Maegor the Cruel. You outlawed every great house. You turned half the realm against you. Your tyranny is known even as far as the free cities. Does your precious honor sleep well, Stark?" Ned's jaw tightened. "I have done what I must. What's done is done. But I offer you a chance to spare your men. Yield Storm's End. Swear fealty to the crown. You may remain as Castellan, as caretaker, if you vow to uphold the peace." Stannis's eyes narrowed. "Swear fealty to a wolf who gnaws on the bones of every other house? Never. I'd sooner see Storm's End crumble into the sea." Lightning flashed, illuminating the tension between them. For a moment, Ned saw not just Stannis, but the unyielding refusal that had carried him through so many storms. He realized there would be no peaceful resolution. Stannis would fight to the death. The threat of an endless siege loomed large. Ned's men might eventually starve Storm's End, but at a terrible cost. Still, the realm could not abide a great house or a rival claimant to remain free. Ned felt an echo of the same dread he'd carried all these months. "So be it," he said quietly. "I will give you one more chance on my honor. After that, we attack. And we will not spare one stone of Storm's End if you force our hand." Stannis met his threat with a cold, hollow stare. "Then come. Show me this Wolf King's might." He turned, disappearing behind the gates as they slammed shut. Ned returned to his lines, soaked and brooding. This was the last stand of the Baratheons. The seeds of Robert's rebellion had begun in that very castle, in a war fought to depose a tyrant. Now, ironically, Ned was the one being called tyrant. He could almost hear Robert's boisterous laughter in the thunder, mocking them both for how far they'd strayed. The next morning, the assault on Storm's End began in earnest. Catapults hammered the walls, and sappers tried to undermine them. Barrels of pitch were ignited to flush out defenders from the ramparts. But the fortress held, the defenders responding with flaming arrows and boiling oil. Losses climbed on both sides. Days turned into weeks. Ned ordered more supplies brought from King's Landing, more engineers to craft siege towers. The progress was slow, and morale sank like a stone in a well. On a grim evening weeks into the siege, a ferocious storm battered the camp. Tents were torn free, the sea roiled. Under the cover of howling wind and hammering rain, a sortie from the castle emerged, led by none other than Stannis. They struck a section of the siege lines, setting ablaze the catapults and the half-constructed towers. The defenders tore through the startled crown forces, leaving scores of men dead. It was a desperate gambit, but it worked. By the time Ned rallied his men, the damage was done, and Stannis's band had retreated behind the walls. Surveying the smoking wreckage at dawn, Ned felt the sting of near despair. How many more men had to die? But he marshaled his forces again. This time, he mustered the largest assault yet. Siege towers dragged forward under shields, rams battered at the gates, Northern archers rained arrows upon the ramparts. The defenders responded with savage tenacity, hurling stones and oil. The parapets became a charnel house. But after hours of bitter fighting, a section of wall near the gates began to crumble under the combined efforts of the sappers and catapults. Seeing their chance, Ned ordered an all-out push. Hundreds of men swarmed forward, braving the hail of arrows to exploit the breach. They smashed into the castle yard, establishing a foothold. Ned led from the front, grimly hacking through Baratheon knights who refused to yield, each brandishing the crowned stag sigil with dying pride. Step by bloody step, the attackers pushed deeper. The defenders fell back to the keep, fighting fiercely. In that swirl of chaos, Ned saw Stannis again, helmet dented, sword in hand, his face a mask of fanatical resolve. Stannis advanced on Ned, ignoring the corpses at his feet. "Is this the peace you promised, Stark?" he snarled. "Butcher's work and ruin?" Ned swallowed, raising his sword. "I gave you a chance to surrender. This is your doing too." Their blades met in a crash of sparks. Stannis was older, but he fought with the ferocity of desperation. Ned parried blow after blow, feeling the sting through his arms. He had already fought for hours. Weariness sapped him, but he would not retreat. Each man sought an opening, a finishing strike. The swirl of the battle parted around them like the eye of a storm. Stannis lunged, trying to drive his blade under Ned's guard. Ned pivoted, the steel scraping off his breastplate. With a grunt, he slammed the pommel of his sword into Stannis's ribs. Stannis staggered, gasping, but retaliated with a savage hack that bit into Ned's thigh. Pain flared, and Ned almost collapsed, but he forced himself to remain upright, blocking the next blow. Lightning flashed overhead. In that momentary light, Ned saw the madness in Stannis's eyes. A man who believed wholeheartedly in his right. A man who would never yield, who saw no world in which his defeat was anything but injustice. Ned felt an icy clarity. If he did not finish this, Stannis would fight on. Another blow hammered Ned's shield, cracking it. Summoning the last of his strength, Ned twisted his blade free and drove it toward Stannis's chest. A direct thrust. Stannis tried to sidestep, but the edge caught him in the shoulder, piercing armor and flesh. He cried out, dropping to his knees. Ned stood above him, sword trembling. Around them, the last pockets of defenders were being overwhelmed by the crown's forces. The courtyard swarmed with men shouting victory, while the battered defenders fell in droves. Stannis coughed, blood staining his lips. His sword slipped from his grip. Ned looked down, chest heaving. Here at last was the final great House Lord. If Ned spared him, the war might drag on. Some new hope for the Baratheons to rally. If Ned ended him here, House Baratheon would die with him. This was the logic that had guided him from the start. No more great houses, no more endless war. The realm might finally be forcibly welded together. With a hoarse cry, Ned drove his blade home. A last protest died on Stannis's lips. Then he slumped, eyes fixed in disbelief. Storm's End was lost. The battered fortress soon echoed with the cheers of the victors. The Wolf King had triumphed again. But Ned felt no triumph as he stood in the keep's hall, gazing at the bodies. The Baratheon line had ended in blood on the stones. The Stormlands, seat of Robert's old glory, had fallen to the northern wolves. Outside, the storm raged on, a fitting lament for a proud house that had defied fate to the end. After the siege, the realm stood in a strange hush. Dorne remained unsubdued, but it had not yet openly attacked. The Ironborn were scattered, their principal leaders captured or dead. The Lannisters were outlawed and broken, the Tyrells likewise. Stannis was gone. The Tully seat, though dear to Catelyn, had been subsumed under loyal crown lords. Targaryens might loom across the sea, but for the moment, Westeros itself belonged to Eddard Stark by right of conquest. Ned returned to King's Landing once more, limping slightly from his wound. The city's gates opened before him, and the crowd's reaction was muted. They had cheered him as a savior before, but the rumors of the Storm's End slaughter, the sight of so many northern banners riding in, cast a pall. Some knelt, others stared in sullen silence. Soldiers loyal to Ned lined the streets to maintain order. At the Red Keep, Ned was greeted by his family. Sansa and Arya stood with Catelyn, all three looking tired and drawn. The court bowed as he climbed the steps to the Iron Throne, where he sank down with a wince. Silence reigned in the cavernous hall. Ned surveyed the faces, reading fear, caution, and a flicker of relief in some. The great houses were undone. The realm was, at least on paper, unified under House Stark. He should have felt relief, perhaps even grim satisfaction. Instead, he felt only a cold hollowness. Every vow of mercy he had tried to uphold had brought more war. Every decree to unify the realm had led to more bloodshed. He remembered the man he had been in Winterfell, wishing only to raise his children in peace. That man seemed far away now. He addressed the hall in a voice that echoed, "The rebellions have been quelled. The outlawed houses have fallen. House Stark stands as the sole great house of Westeros, unchallenged." The words were factual, but they tasted like ash. Yet peace must be built. "We will divide the realm more equitably among lesser lords loyal to the crown. We will rebuild trade routes, restore farmland, ensure food for the small folk. Let the realm heal." A few scattered cheers arose, but they were half-hearted. People knew that the realm's scars ran deep. Fear of the Wolf King lingered in every corner. What once might have been a tapestry of proud banners was now reduced to the single image of a direwolf. Perhaps someday in the future, men would grow used to the new order, living without the old houses. But Ned suspected that day might never truly dawn in his lifetime. He had used a monstrous means to end monstrous feuds, and perhaps the realm was doomed to remember him as the dreaded Stark who ruled through conquest and laws of iron. Later, Ned found himself alone in his solar. The dawn outside was pale, the city below strangely calm. Catelyn stepped in, face lined with worry. "It's done," she said, sitting beside him. He nodded. "Yes, if Dorne keeps quiet, then for now it's done." He let out a long breath. "I've spent my life believing that a ruler's first duty is to protect the realm. But at what cost, Cat?" She took his hand, feeling the tension that still coiled within him. "You've done what you thought right. You tried to spare the small folk another generation of civil wars. And ended the old ways in blood," he murmured. "I've carved a new realm with steel and sorrow, and the ghosts of houses centuries old will haunt these halls. Even if we've won, can this truly be called victory?" Catelyn squeezed his hand gently. "History will judge us, Ned. But perhaps, with time, the realm will know peace under one banner. Perhaps we can heal." He looked away, eyes heavy with regret. "I hope you are right. For the sake of our children, I hope you are right." Their conversation fell into quiet. Beyond the walls, the realm carried on, battered and uncertain, ruled by a man whose sense of honor had been crushed beneath necessity. Eddard Stark, once the living embodiment of northern virtue, had become the Wolf King who outlawed every great house but his own. No one could deny that the feuds which had plagued Westeros were ended in one fell stroke. Yet the seeds of resentment, loss, and vengeance still lay buried beneath the ashes. In the hearts of many, they waited for a chance to sprout, nurtured by grief and memory. Thus, for now, the story closed on a conquered land. The direwolf reigned over all, but the unspoken question lingered in every silent courtyard and lonely field. Would this ruthless unification buy a generation of stability, or had Eddard Stark planted the seeds of a future, even greater conflagration? The crows that wheeled above the battlements seemed to sense the tension in the air, as though uncertain whether to proclaim the dawn of a new age or to caw in lament for all that had been lost. For the moment, winter had not yet come in earnest, but its chill seeped through the halls, echoing the cold finality of Ned's decree. He had sundered the ancient houses and built a single, unyielding fortress of power House Stark, enthroned upon the Iron Throne. He had sacrificed the ideals he once cherished to save a realm from endless war. Whether that realm could ever truly forgive him or find peace without the old pillars of power remained to be seen. But in the hush that followed, In the battered quiet of a land too tired to keep fighting, Westeros bent the knee to the Wolf King. And Eddard Stark, weighed down by his crown of hammered steel and direwolf sigils, wondered in the solitude of each sleepless night whether he had won the realm or lost himself. Eddard Stark rose before dawn and stood at one of the narrow windows of the Royal Solar, gazing out over the still dark city of King's Landing. Beyond the walls, the black sky began to gray, and here and there he could see the faint glow of torches winding through streets that climbed the hills toward the Red Keep. Unseen beneath the dim horizon lay the fields where so many had died, the roads that carried the footprints of marching armies, his armies. He heard faint echoes of the realm's sorrow, or perhaps they were only the moans of the wind coursing off the Blackwater. His reflection in the glass was tired, eyes ringed with shadows. How many nights had he slept fitfully, haunted by the faces of the men and women whose lives he'd upended? Too many to count. He pressed his palm to the cold stone of the windowsill, feeling as though he were trying to steady himself atop a precipice. He felt a hand on his shoulder. Catelyn. She had awakened as well, silently crossing the chamber to him. Though the hush of early morning draped them both, the tension of the Red Keep pressed in with every heartbeat. He covered her hand with his own in a gesture of gratitude. Sometimes words failed them, for there was so little solace to be found in pleasantries. But her presence reminded him that there was something left in the world beyond crowns and decrees. With the faintest light creeping across the city, the bells began to toll from the great September, a low, solemn peal. Ned realized it must be the hour of the sparrow. Day had truly come, the final day or a new day, for what was left of the great houses of Westeros he had shattered. He could never shake the awareness that in forging this unity, he had heaped upon himself the mantle of conqueror. The Wolf King, some called him. Others whispered the Northern Tyrant. He had told himself for so long that it was not ambition that drove him, but necessity. That every new stone laid in this kingdom of direwolf banners would shield the small folk from the ravages of warring lords. Yet how often had the small folk themselves been the ones to bleed? He exhaled, turning from the window. "I must convene the council soon," he said quietly. "We have decisions to make regarding Dorne." Catelyn's eyes were soft but grave. "Will you truly press them for terms now?" His lips twitched in what might have been a bitter smile. "There is no choice. If Dorne remains aloof, it's only a matter of time before they form alliances and launch their own rebellion. I cannot let another war fester. I must do what I've done with every other house." He felt his stomach turn at the thought of more conflict. "So soon after Storm's End," Catelyn's voice trailed, leaving the rest unsaid. The memory of the final storming of Storm's End hung over them both like a grim tapestry. Ned's sword sliding home in Stannis Baratheon's chest. The courtyard dyed in blood, the battered fortress taken at last. The old ties of friendship and fealty, going all the way back to Robert's rebellion, had been severed by that single stroke. Even if they had parted ways long ago, it still felt like a betrayal of everything they once fought for. Ned could not bear to dwell on it too long. He had to move forward. "Summon those of the council who are here," he said, and Catelyn nodded. Though she no longer held the same illusions she once had about how to guide or advise him, she still stayed at his side. Marriage vows, family loyalty, these were old ties. He felt grateful and guilty in equal measure. He dressed in silence, letting the servants slip in to assist with his cloak, his sword belt, the heavy ring he wore as king. Each ceremonial piece felt like another link in a chain binding him to the role he had never wanted, yet had claimed so relentlessly. When he emerged into the corridor, he was flanked by guards wearing stark colors, their footsteps echoing through the high arches as they guided him toward the council chamber. Along the way, they passed rows of torches that guttered in the faint dawn. The Red Keep had long ago lost the gold and crimson that once adorned it under the Targaryens or even the Black Stag banners under Robert. Now, the dire wolf of House Stark stared down from nearly every wall hanging. That constant reminder made Ned's gut clench. His sigil was everywhere. He had become precisely the absolute authority he once believed no man should wield. At the doors of the council chamber, the guards opened the way. Ned stepped inside to find a small knot of people waiting. Maester Argrave, young but precise in his manner. Ser Barristan Selmy, who had remained steadfast in service to the crown however uncertain he might be in his heart. Lord Bolton, who had recently returned from the Reach. Lord Manderley, stoic as always, representing the new crown fleet. There were a few others, lesser lords promoted to the King's Council for their loyalty. Men from the Riverlands, the Crownlands, and even some from the Westerlands who had allied themselves with the new regime rather than cling to the memory of Lannister gold. None of them bore the old storied names that had once ruled the realm. They all wore the gray or white insignias assigned to them as a sign of direct fealty to House Stark. Ned moved to the head of the table, settling into the tall chair that was more comfortable than the Iron Throne but hardly less intimidating. Maester Argrave dipped his head in acknowledgement, then cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we have pressing matters across the realm. Foremost, Dorne. Reports suggest that the Lords of the Sands are gathering soldiers. They have not openly declared war, but they strengthen their borders. Merchants traveling the Boneway speak of taxes and tolls rising. There's also talk they've sent envoys to Essos." Ned rested his elbows on the table. Envoys to Essos could mean they're courting Sellsword companies or, gods forbid, forging alliances with exiled Targaryens. We've heard rumors of Daenerys Stormborn across the sea. I fear they might see that as their chance at vengeance. Bolton's eyes gleamed with that calm, unsettling focus Ned had come to know too well. If Dorne invites Targaryens to land in Sunspear, we'll have a war on two fronts. One that might unite all those who still hate us. Better we strike first. Ned bristled at the suggestion, though in truth, it was the same conclusion he had come to with every other recalcitrant region. Is there no alternative to immediate war? Could we not reach out, offer a treaty as we did with the Stormlands? That particular so-called treaty had ended only in blood, of course, but he clung to any shred of possible peace. Lord Manderley cleared his throat. "Your Grace, the Martells and their allies have long memories. The murder of Elia Martell and her children during the sack of King's Landing. That injustice still burns hot in Dornish hearts. And now you've outlawed their house. Many of them will see it as the final affront. They may see no reason to compromise, only to plan revenge." Ned recognized the truth in that. "Still, we must try. Maester, draft letters offering terms if they will accept the new order, as the other houses have been forced to do. Promise them a measure of self-governance under the crown, so long as no Martell sits as a Lord Paramount. They can keep certain privileges, lesser titles, maybe, if they submit." Bolton gave a faint scoff, though carefully. "They won't submit to that, Your Grace. Dornish pride is fierce. They'll see it as humiliation." Ned met his gaze. "They may, but a letter is less costly than another war. I will give them a chance. If they refuse, we prepare to march." No one spoke for a moment. The unspoken conclusion was clear. Yet again, if the Dornish refused to kneel, Ned would do as he had done to every other major region. He would crush them. The cycle repeated, and it wore on Ned's soul. But he saw no other road. The discussion turned to smaller matters: post-war rebuilding in the Westerlands, confiscation of certain Lannister resources that might help feed King's Landing, the leftover remnants of Tyrell loyalists in the Reach who harassed Crown forces, the ongoing famine in some pockets of the realm due to disrupted harvests. Each matter was significant, yet each pulled at the tapestry of what was left of Westeros, threatening to unravel it further. Finally, the council adjourned. Ned lingered, ignoring the gnawing ache in his leg from the wound Stannis had dealt him. The wound was slow to heal. Perhaps it festered as a sign that some hurts never truly mended. He leaned over the table, staring at the flickering candle that was almost spent, dripping wax onto the polished oak. If only, he thought, if only there had been a simpler path. Yet the memory of watching Robert's realm tear itself apart with cunning and ambition reminded him there was no other way. He inhaled a shaky breath, then turned to go. Outside, he passed Barristan in the corridor. The old knight gave him a respectful nod. Ned couldn't help but recall how Ser Barristan had once served Aerys Targaryen, then Robert, then Joffrey briefly, and now Ned himself. What a life of loyalty, tested and tested again. Ned paused. Ser Barristan. A word, if you please. They stepped aside into a small alcove. Barristan's expression was serious as ever. Your Grace. Ned studied him. I value your counsel, old friend. You have seen kings come and go. You have seen houses rise and fall. Tell me, is there any chance that we can hold this realm together without more blood? His voice was soft, almost an entreaty. Barristan hesitated, glancing at the guards a few feet away. He lowered his voice, speaking with quiet candor. Your Grace, I have never seen a realm so changed, nor so frightened. In truth, you have suppressed rebellion with more determination than any king in living memory. But I fear the cost. King Ares believed that fear would keep the realm in line. We saw how that ended. Ned's jaw tightened. I am not Ares, he said, though there was no anger in his tone, only weariness. Barristan nodded. You are not. You do this for reasons you believe just. Yet the realm sees only the devastation, the endless punishments, the dissolution of old houses. Targaryen madness burned men alive. Your war has consumed the houses in the name of peace. The difference is in your heart, but hearts are not always visible to those who suffer. Ned's shoulders slumped a fraction. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been kinder to let them keep their pride and let war burn us all. But I will not let the realm descend into chaos. Even if they name me tyrant, this must be done. Barristan bowed his head with respect. You have my sword, Your Grace. I hope, in time, people see your intentions, not merely the method. They parted ways, and Ned resumed his path through the corridors. But the old knight's words coiled around his thoughts like a constricting serpent. He could not fault the logic. The realm's fear was tangible. Perhaps only time would decide if this new order was tyranny or a last gasp of hope. For now, Ned had no choice but to remain upon his path. In the following days, ravens went out to Sunspear, to the lords of the marches, to every rumored stronghold of Dornish power. They carried letters sealed with the direwolf sigil of House Stark, offering terms that might, in another age, be called lenient. But in this new reality, they were demands for complete subjugation. Surrender your house claims, swear fealty to the Wolf King, and you may keep your lives, your lands, under the watchful eye of northern appointed castellans. It was an arrangement only slightly less humiliating than total conquest. Ned waited in tense apprehension to see if Dorne would respond. Meanwhile, the realm's slow rebuilding ground on. In King's Landing, the reorganization of trade routes and marketplaces was stymied by the aftereffects of war. The farmers had lost seeds or livestock in raids. Merchants feared sending caravans on roads that might still harbor bandits or leftover sellswords. The crown's treasury, bolstered by confiscated Lannister wealth, could only stretch so far. And Ned faced a moral dilemma each time more coin was demanded. Should he funnel gold into feeding small folk, or send it to the new northern garrisons in the Reach, the Westerlands, and the Stormlands? He tried to strike a balance, but found himself forced to make impossible choices. People starved regardless. All the while, the halls of the Red Keep teemed with new faces, lesser lords from every corner of the realm who had been elevated in some form. Instead of House Tyrell, you had Lord Meadows or Lord Footley or Lord Mullendore, men who had sworn absolute loyalty to the crown. In the Westerlands, unnamed knights who once served as lesser bannermen now oversaw gold mines or manned the fortress at Castamere. It was a realm of patchwork authority, each piece wedged into place by fear or raw necessity. The tapestry held, but barely. Sansa Stark found this patchwork especially disorienting. She had dreamed of a life in court, full of lords and ladies wearing gorgeous silks and speaking in graceful tongues. Instead, the Red Keep corridors brimmed with hardened northern officers and suspicious southern knights who wore plain cloth and rough leathers, each ready to draw steel if a rumor flared of disloyalty. The ladies of the southern courts were fewer than ever. Many had fled or taken vows in the mother houses. Those who remained were the wives and daughters of newly installed lords, some of whom might be kind, but many looked at Sansa as though she were a symbol of everything they had lost or had been forced to swear to. She tried to organize small gatherings, dances, feasts to lift morale, but found the mood oppressive, weighed down by the constant knowledge that the realm's old order was dead. and so she drifted, her illusions gone. There were no elegant songs about Eddard Stark, the Wolf King, only hushed laments at what the realm had become. Arya Stark, for her part, tried to lose herself in sword practice. In a courtyard behind the Red Keep stables, she trained with a Braavosi water dancer who had once been introduced by Syrio Farrell's acquaintances. The man, slender and nimble, taught her how to move lightly, how to read an opponent's stance. She threw herself into these exercises, preferring the sweat and sting of bruises to the suffocating solemnity of the castle. Yet even as she practiced, she could not escape the sense that she was swirling in a dance with no music, that the world around her had lost its melody. Every day, she saw Ned from a distance and glimpsed the weight on his shoulders. She wanted to free him from it, but knew she could not. Sometimes she dreamed of running away to explore the corners of Westeros, what was left of it. Perhaps she'd find real knights somewhere, men who had not forsaken the code of chivalry. But then she would recall how the great houses had each believed themselves honorable, only for war to reveal that all men bled the same. In the midst of these personal struggles, a raven arrived from Sunspear. It bore the personal seal of Prince Doran Martell, though Prince was no longer an official title under the new laws. Nonetheless, that was how he signed it. Ned read the letter alone in his solar. Doran's words were polished, careful, each line revealing sharp intelligence behind every phrase. He acknowledged Ned's letter, recognized the legitimacy of the Wolf King's sovereignty, and invited an envoy to treat with him in Sunspear, so that they might amicably discuss the terms for Dorne's future. But the subtext was obvious. Doran had no intention of kneeling outright. He wanted negotiation, a chance to wring as many concessions as possible. And given how precarious the realm was, he might believe Ned would be forced to give them. Ned rubbed his brow, torn between relief and suspicion. At least this was not an outright refusal or open defiance. But if Doran thought to exploit the realm's weakness, they might drag out negotiations for months, even years. In that time, Sellsword companies or Targaryen exiles might rally to the Dornish cause. War could still erupt, and it might be far worse if Daenerys Targaryen arrived with rumored dragons. He did not want to see that. The memory of the Mad King's atrocities loomed large, and no matter how many times Ned reminded himself that Daenerys was but a child when she fled Westeros, the name Targaryen conjured images of wildfire and betrayal. He summoned his council. After reading them the letter, he asked for counsel on what envoy to send. Bolton was the first to speak. Going to Sunspear is a risk. Dorne is known for poison, subterfuge, cunning. Sending a single envoy might result in a dagger in the ribs and a polite apology. Better to march an army to the Prince's Pass and show we are not to be trifled with. Ned frowned. I won't provoke a war if they're inviting diplomacy. Better to attempt the peaceful road. We send someone we trust. Someone who can handle the Dornish intrigue without being easily manipulated. Ser Barristan quietly offered, Your Grace, I have no love for Dorne, but I have served with men from there. I know some of their ways. If you command it, I will go as your envoy. Ned admired the old knight's courage. Yet he could not ignore the possibility that Barristan might be recognized as a symbol of Targaryen times, of Robert's rebellion, of so many old grudges. Could be a liability. I value your loyalty, Ser Barristan, but let me consider another possibility. Perhaps a younger, more neutral presence. Someone who can appear less threatening, or at least less reminiscent of old wars. The lords around the table exchanged glances. Manderly eventually spoke. Your Grace, you might send one of your own kin. An envoy of the royal family might show seriousness and respect. Ned's heart lurched. One of his children, in Dorne, surrounded by potential hostilities? He could not imagine risking Sansa or Arya. Robb was in the north, needed there to maintain stability. Bran and Rickon were too young, safe in Winterfell. Catelyn was out of the question. She had no love for Dorne, and the loss of her father during the rebellion weighed on her. He dismissed the notion of sending a child, though some part of him recognized that it was a practice once used to seal alliances. A ward or hostage often smoothed negotiations. But he could not stomach that. "Not my children," he said firmly. "We must choose carefully. Ser Barristan, you will lead the delegation, but you will take with you a handful of knights well-versed in diplomacy. Perhaps men from the Reach who have fought but are not so deeply mired in blood feuds with Dorne. We will give you the authority to negotiate terms, but keep them within reason. If the Dornish demand full restoration of House Martell, that is not acceptable." Barristan inclined his head. "I understand, Your Grace. I will do my utmost to ensure a fair outcome." Ned turned to Bolton and the other lords. "Meanwhile, we prepare. If negotiations fail, we must be ready to press into Dorne swiftly, not allow them time to organize or bring over Sellsword companies from Essos." Bolton's thin smile widened a fraction. "A prudent approach." With that decided, the group moved on to other matters of state. Ned felt an odd mixture of hope and dread, as though he were staring at a door that might open to sunlight or to a hail of arrows. Every day of his reign felt like that now. There was no respite, only the relentless march of events. True to his word, Ser Barristan departed with a small retinue within the week, heading south through the Stormlands, where the memory of Stannis Baratheon's last stand still clung to the battered towers, and then onward to the dusty passes leading into Dorne. Ned saw him off at the Red Keep stables, clasping his hand in farewell. "May the gods guide you," Ned said, noticing the silver in Barristan's hair glinting in the morning light. "You have all the authority you need to promise them a place in the realm, as we've done elsewhere. But remain firm that no Martell can hold princely power." Barristan donned his helm and bowed. "I shall do what I can, Your Grace. Pray that the Dornish want peace as much as we do." After they rode off, Ned lingered near the stable yard, the smell of hay and horse dung mingling in the late summer heat. He recalled how once these sights and smells had been comforting, reminiscent of Winterfell's stable yard, of simpler times when he was but a lord with a family to protect. Now the weight of the crown pressed on him constantly, overshadowing every memory with the knowledge that so many had died in pursuit of this forced unity. Catelyn approached, tucking a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "He's a good man," she said, watching Barristan's party vanish beyond the gate. "If anyone can speak plainly with the Dornish, it might be him." Ned managed a nod. "He has more honor than most. Yet we both know even the most honorable can be undone by cunning foes." She slipped her arm through his. "No path is without risk. We can only choose the one we believe best for the realm." He kissed her cheek gently, grateful for the fleeting warmth of her presence. "So we must." The days that followed felt endless. Ned occupied himself with the workings of the crown, reorganizing the city watch, ensuring supply wagons from the Reach and Westerlands continued to feed the capital, hearing petitions from minor lords who sought to restore properties or shift boundaries. Each petition was a reminder that the old feudal structure, for all its flaws, had lent some measure of stability. Now every corner of the realm needed fresh lines of authority. It was exhausting labor, but Ned did not shirk it. He had assumed this crown. He would bear the load. Perhaps, he told himself, one day these new structures would hold, and the realm would be at peace. Sometimes he wondered if he was trying to paint over the cracks of a sinking ship. The Stormlands were still not fully calm. There were reports of small holdfasts refusing to recognize the authority of Ned's appointed lord. The Westerlands had bandits who styled themselves as Red Lions, rumored to be rebellious Lannister cousins taking revenge on the new Castellan, the Ironborn. Those who had escaped after Asha's capture continued to raid coastal villages, though they lacked any real leadership. In the Reach, even though Highgarden had fallen, pockets of Tyrell's sworn swords tried to claim hidden storehouses of grain for themselves, forcing crown troops to chase them through the green fields. In every corner, there were reminders that war's embers did not die so easily. One spark could reignite the entire realm. Amid this precarious lull, Ned decided it was time to question Asha Greyjoy. She had been recovering from her wounds in a guarded chamber within the Red Keep's tower. The surgeons had removed the arrow from her side and stitched the gash in her thigh. She had not been well enough to move or escape. She had also refused to utter more than a few mocking words to her guards. Ned descended the spiraling steps to a corridor deep in the Red Keep. The air was cooler there, clammy against his skin. 2 guards in stark livery stood at attention outside a heavy wooden door. Ned nodded to them, and one unlocked the door, letting him in. The chamber was small and bare. A pallet on one side, a wash basin, a single chair. A barred window let in a shaft of pale light. Asha Greyjoy lay against the pallet's thin mattress, her dark hair splayed across a rough pillow. She looked up as Ned entered, and a crooked grin tugged at her lips. "So the Wolf King pays me a visit himself," she said, voice husky. "Ought I be flattered?" Ned glanced at her bandaged side. "I came to see if you're healing." She snorted. "Oh, I'm healing. Slowly. I'd be better if I had salt air and the rocking of a ship, but I'll take what I can get, given that I'm your prisoner." He studied her for a moment. She had a certain wild confidence, even lying wounded and under guard. She was the daughter of Balon Greyjoy, rebellious, proud. But Ned had never fought her personally until that siege in Lannisport, and he'd seen that she was more cunning than her father, less prone to blind fanaticism. Perhaps there was a chance she could be reasoned with. "Your father attempted rebellion once before. The Ironborn have proven time and again that they will not bow to an overlord. Yet House Greyjoy is outlawed now, and you remain the only prominent member in our custody. I would speak plainly. I have no wish to see your people turned into outcasts and raiders forever. If they would only swear fealty, relinquish their claims." She gave a harsh laugh, which turned into a cough. "Relinquish our birthright to plunder and sail free? Kneel to the wolf-shed banners that have taken half the realm by sword? You know nothing of the Ironborn if you think we'll bow that easily." Ned's frown deepened. "You talk of freedom, but what have your raids gained except the hatred of the mainland? Even now, those of your people who remain free cower on stolen ships, with no safe harbor, no recognized place in the realm. Better free in a rotting hull than chained in a castle." Asha shot back, though there was a weariness to her eyes. "We're Ironborn. We pay the iron price, not the gold. We don't kneel." He took a step closer, keeping his tone measured. "That is precisely why the North had no choice but to end your great house. So long as you refused to join the realm, you remained a threat to every coastal village. I wonder, did you ever consider forging alliances, or trading fairly, or anything other than reaving?" She bared her teeth in something like a grin. "Considered it, but my father was blind with ambition. The old way runs in our blood. Maybe it's a curse, or maybe it's our nature. But here we are, with me rotting on a pallet, while the rest of my kin roam or hide. What do you want from me, Stark? A vow on bended knee? A promise that the Ironborn will give up the axe?" Ned didn't flinch from her bitterness. "I want peace, Asha Greyjoy. If your people will not accept subjugation, perhaps there is another way. I'd rather not see more blood spilled when we have enough troubles already." She raised an eyebrow, uncertain whether to mock him. "And what do you propose?" A complicated question, and Ned wasn't certain of the answer himself. But he spoke his thoughts. "If you would openly renounce the Greyjoy claim, if you would persuade your kin to accept crown-appointed oversight of the Iron Islands, perhaps your people could live without constant war. In exchange, they'd keep certain rights to fish, to sail, but not to raid. It would be less harsh than total annihilation. Your father is gone, your uncle scattered. You might be the only one who can lead them onto a different path." Her dark eyes flickered with skepticism, but also a glint of curiosity. "You'd let me lead the Ironborn? After all that's happened? After Lannisport? I'm offering the Ironborn a chance at survival," Ned said quietly. "I'm tired of seeing houses fall to ruin. If you can bring them to heel, to accept the new order, I might be willing to let you govern them as a lesser vassal, answerable directly to me. You'd have no rights to wage war or reave. You'd have to keep your own folk in line." Asha gave a short, humorless bark of a laugh. "Me, a vassal of the Wolf King, ironically reigning over the Iron Islands with a broken sword? The men of the Isles might as soon feed me to the deep as follow me into your subjugation. But if the alternative is to be hounded and hunted until none are left, perhaps they'd see reason." Ned nodded slowly, aware that trust was a fragile thread. Think on it. When you've recovered, you can address your people under guard, yes, but you will be given a chance to speak. If they reject you or your message, then the crown will have no mercy left. She turned her face away, staring at the barred window. I'll think on it. Better that than rotting in your cell until you decide to make an example of me. He stepped back, exhaling softly. We'll speak again. He left, the door clanging shut behind him. Something in her final words stayed with him, an echo of the entire realm's resentment. That he might make an example of them whenever it pleased him. Tyrant or savior, the line had blurred so completely he couldn't tell which side of it he stood on anymore. Yet he would not let the realm descend into chaos. That vow was all he had. He told himself it was enough to keep going. Some weeks passed in uneasy calm. Messages trickled from Ser Barristan's delegation, describing tense but cordial discussions with Prince Doran. The Dornish, it seemed, were testing every angle, demanding certain immunities, certain respects to old treaties. They used the memory of Elia Martell's brutal murder as a bargaining chip, claiming they deserved reparations. Barristan's letters hinted that they might settle for a broad autonomy, essentially to remain Dorn in all but name, while bending the knee to Ned's crown in a purely symbolic sense. Ned was wary of that approach. It could easily become a seed for future rebellion. But if it avoided war, perhaps compromise was possible. Then, one day, a secret raven arrived, marked urgent. Barristan's account had changed drastically. He had discovered evidence that Prince Doran's younger brother, Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper, had been quietly gathering a group of exiled lords, unscrupulous sellswords, and possibly even Targaryen loyalists in the deep deserts. Word had come that Oberyn planned to present them at a covert gathering in Dorne to pledge themselves to a restored monarchy. Which monarchy was unclear, but the rumor was that it might be a Targaryen restoration, or even a Martell monarchy. Barristan urged Ned to send reinforcements or to prepare for a likely betrayal in the negotiations. Ned's blood ran cold as he read the letter alone in his chambers. So the Dornish negotiations were a smokescreen, or at least partially. Prince Doran might not be openly defiant, but Oberyn was the vengeful spear of House Martell. If Oberyn was forging alliances behind the scenes, no treaty in Sunspear's halls would mean anything. Ned realized that if they waited too long, an open invitation to a Targaryen or a Sellsword army could come at any time. He had to act. He called the council that very morning. Bolton, Manderley, and the other lords listened grimly as Ned read Barristan's message. They were not surprised. The lords nodded at one another, their earlier caution falling away to a more aggressive stance. We must strike Dorne now, Bolton said, voice calm but urgent. Surprise them before Oberyn can bring these alliances to fruition. Manderley concurred. I'll have the Crown's fleet circle the peninsula from the sea. We can land forces near Planky Town or in the Broken Arm region to cut off escape routes. Ned felt that old sense of dread coil in his stomach. Another war, another region to subdue by force. Yet what choice did he have? If Oberyn succeeded in rallying Sellswords or, worse, a Targaryen claimant, the entire realm could erupt. The small folk would suffer again. He was desperate to prevent that, even if it meant marching once more. We'll give Prince Doran a final ultimatum, Ned decided. He must turn over Oberyn Martell to us, must open his gates to Crown forces as a sign of loyalty. If he refuses, we begin the invasion. The council quickly drafted the ultimatum. Ravens flew south. Simultaneously, Ned gave orders for the army to muster along the Dornish marches, those desert borderlands that had seen so many wars in the past. The men in King's Landing prepared to march, including many newly promoted knights from the Crownlands and the battered but still formidable northern veterans. Ned's instructions were clear. Minimize harm to the small folk if possible, but do not hesitate to crush any organized resistance. Many old campaigners wore grim smiles. A new war, the last war, they said. The war to end all Dornish hopes of independence. As the days passed and no response arrived, Ned's sense of foreboding grew. He remembered how swiftly Stannis had forced him into a siege. He remembered the cunning strategies of Tyrion Lannister, the covert alliances of the Tyrells, the Ironborn's savage cunning. House Martell might be even more dangerous, for Dorne had never been fully conquered by the Targaryens or the dragons, save through marriage. They had a tradition of independence going back centuries. He gathered his family in the Red Keep's main courtyard before departing. Sansa and Arya stood beside Catelyn, their eyes filled with conflicting emotions. They had watched him leave for war so many times now. Yet each time, the realm's troubles demanded he return to the field. He knelt briefly before Arya, adjusting the collar of her cloak. "You'll remain here with your mother and sister. The city is well garrisoned. Obey your mother's instructions, and keep practicing your lessons, child." Arya frowned, arms folded. "I'm not a child anymore." Then her voice quivered. "Father, must you go again?" Ned's heart squeezed. I must ensure the realm's safety." She looked away, blinking quickly. "Then come back safe." He turned to Sansa, who managed a brave smile. "We'll do our part to help keep the peace here in your absence," she said, though her voice wavered. Catelyn stood silent for a moment, then embraced him. He inhaled the faint lavender scent in her hair, recalling the crisp northern winds of Winterfell, so far behind them. "Be careful," she whispered. "Dorne is not the Stormlands or the Reach. If Oberyn truly has a hidden force, you could be walking into a pit of vipers." He drew back, gazing into her eyes. "I know, but I cannot stand idle while they conspire. This must be done." She nodded, tears glistening, but she did not argue. She knew too well that there was no path but forward. With that final farewell, Ned mounted his horse, signaled his guards, and rode out of King's Landing at the head of a great column bearing Stark banners. Thousands of men marched with him, some from the north, others from the Crownlands, the Stormlands, the Reach. All were united under the Direwolf, though many wore it only as a matter of survival. They knew how the Wolf King dealt with traitors. The journey south along the Rose Road and then into the Dornish marches took them through land scorched by the late summer sun. Fields turned dry and cracked. Water became precious. Small fortifications dotted the border, manned by uneasy local garrisons uncertain how to greet the approaching army. Most eventually yielded with no fight, not wishing to be branded rebels. Bit by bit, Ned's host approached the mountain passes that led into Dorne itself. Scouts reported that the Dornish were massing near the Prince's Pass and the Boneway. The air bristled with tension, like a bowstring pulled taut. They made camp near Nightsong, a fortress that had changed hands multiple times in the swirl of the recent wars. Now it belonged to a lord sworn to the crown, though that lord was none other than a minor branch of House Cairn, who had once sworn to House Baratheon. Their new loyalty was a reflection of necessity rather than devotion. Ned visited the castle's hall to speak with the local lord, hearing stories of Dornish raids near the border. He listened gravely, aware that the lords of the Marches hated Dorne for centuries of conflict. They were more than willing to see the Martells crushed once and for all. That night, Ned dreamed of Winterfell. He saw the old Godswood, the heart tree with its solemn face, branches stirring in a cold wind. The smell of pine and snow suffused his senses. In the dream, he knelt at the tree's base, his hands stained red, dripping onto the roots. He tried to wash them in the black pool, but the water turned to blood. The heart tree's face wept silent tears of sap. He awoke gasping, heart pounding, the dryness of the Dornish marches thick in his throat. He stared at the tense dark ceiling, listening to the muffled movements of sleeping soldiers. Duty, he told himself. Only duty. He lay awake until the sky paled outside. The next day, scouts returned at a gallop with reports of a Dornish force mustering in the shadow of the Prince's Pass. Banners of the Sun and Spear were present. Thousands of spears, cavalry, and even rumored siege weapons. They had dug in behind fortifications at the pass, clearly expecting a confrontation. Ned weighed the option of a direct assault, which might be costly, or bypassing them by splitting the army to approach from multiple routes. But Dorne's geography was treacherous, and an army that split in the desert might be more vulnerable to ambush. He decided to meet them at the pass, bringing the bulk of his forces together. He hoped a final show of might would force the Dornish to yield. So the army advanced. The winding road led between rocky slopes, the sun glaring overhead. Heat shimmered off the stones, and the men trudged forward, sweat beading on their brows. Banners wilted, horses panted. Still, the northern discipline held, and the rest of the combined forces followed their lead. As they neared the pass's mouth, they could see a barrier of sharpened stakes and walls of packed earth the Dornish had erected. Over it all flew the spear through the rising sun, House Martell's sigil, flapping defiantly in the breeze. Ned rode forward on a tall destrier, flanked by knights bearing the direwolf standard. He halted within earshot of the Dornish lines. Trumpets sounded from both sides. A lone rider emerged from the Dornish barricade, a man in light leather armor, his tunic emblazoned with the sun and spear. He lifted a horn to his lips and blew once, the call echoing across the pass. Ned raised a hand in parley. "I am Eddard Stark, King of the Seven Kingdoms. I come with an offer for Prince Doran Martell. Surrender Oberyn Martell into our custody, open the roads, and cease all conspiracies against the crown. Do this, and we need not shed more blood." The Dornish rider stared impassively. Then he announced in a clear voice, "Prince Doran Martell sends word. Dorne stands proud. We will not yield to the Wolf King who has outlawed our house. Withdraw or face the wrath of Dorne." An uneasy rustle went through the ranks of Ned's men. This was a refusal, an open defiance. Still, Ned tried once more. "Prince Doran is said to be a man of reason. If we must speak steel to steel, it will end only in death. Call him forth. Let us speak face to face." The Dornish rider's eyes narrowed. "Prince Doran does not come at your summons. Our terms are simple. Leave Dorne to rule itself or die trying to subjugate it." With that, the rider wheeled his horse around and galloped back behind the barricade. Ned closed his eyes briefly, feeling the tension snap. War was upon them. He turned to his own war council, Bolton, Manderley, several other lords. Their faces were set. In grim lines, "We proceed," Ned said, voice low. "Form ranks. Prepare the engines if they refuse to open the road by morning." At dawn, the armies faced each other across the pass. The sun glared, reflecting off steel. Ned gave one last signal, a single trumpet blast indicating a final call to surrender. No movement from the Dornish. Then the Crown's catapults and archers unleashed their opening barrage, raining stones and arrows onto the barricades. The Dornish responded in kind, releasing a volley of their own. Screams and shouts echoed. Smoke rose from the dry scrub when flaming arrows set brush alight. The wind carried the acrid smell of burning pitch. Under cover of the barrage, Bolton led a vanguard of infantry to storm the barricade. They crashed into sharpened stakes, entangled in spiked pitfalls the Dornish had prepared. Casualties mounted quickly. The northern soldiers fought doggedly, hacking at the wooden defenses while under a hail of arrows. Eventually, they pulled down a section of the barricade, opening a breach, and a surge of Crown troops rushed through. The Dornish defenders met them with spears and curved blades, the fighting intense in the narrow confines of the pass. Ned watched from a raised position, wincing as he saw good men fall. The goal was to break through quickly, preventing the Dornish from retreating deeper. But the pass was well chosen. The men in the vanguard were paying a steep price. Hours slid by in a haze of dust, blood, and the constant clangor of steel. Ned, leading a contingent of cavalry, at last received word that Bolton's infantry had gained a foothold inside the pass. With that opening, Ned signaled the cavalry to charge, hoping to sweep aside the Dornish lines. The riders thundered in, hoofs pounding the hard-packed ground. At first, it seemed the Dornish would break. But then a cavalry of their own emerged from behind a rocky outcrop, slamming into Ned's flank. The sudden clash of horse and steel took Ned's breath away. He found himself in the thick of it, sword drawn, fending off a Dornish knight who wore a half-helm shaped like a snarling cougar. The man's lance splintered against Ned's shield. Ned retaliated with a slash that cut deep into the knight's arm, toppling him. Another Dornish warrior came from the side, spitting curses. Ned barely parried, feeling the shock of impact up his arm. In the swirling chaos, dust clogged the air. Crown banners jostled with sun and spear sigils. Ned glimpsed Bolton hacking down a Dornish spearman, blood spattering. Manderley led a wedge of heavy infantry forward, their shields bristling. Step by step, the Crown forces pressed the Dornish back. But the Martell defenders did not break easily. The pass became a kill zone, bodies piling among jagged rocks and broken stakes. Vultures circled overhead, waiting for a feast. At last, by midday, the barricade was fully breached. The Dornish withdrew deeper, their lines fraying under the relentless assault. Ned pressed forward, determined to keep the momentum. If the Dornish rallied deeper in the pass, the battle could drag on, giving Oberyn time to strike from behind or lead a second force to trap them. Their best chance was to force a decisive engagement here. Trumpets from the Crown side signaled an all-out push, and the men advanced in a blood-soaked tide. The Dornish lines wavered, many falling back, some fighting to the death, cursing the name of the Wolf King. Ned found himself at the head of a contingent that reached a vantage point overlooking a wide bowl of land inside the pass. Far below lay the bulk of the Dornish camp. Tents, supply wagons, scattered cavalry. There he glimpsed a cluster of men bearing ornate banners, likely High Lords or Martell officials. He rallied his cavalry, preparing to ride down into the bowl and shatter their command structure. This was how wars were won. Strike the center, break the leadership, watch the rest flee or surrender. He swallowed his distaste. More blood, always more blood. He led the descent, hoofbeats pounding, swords raised. The Dornish, already disarrayed, scrambled to form a defensive line. Some launched arrows. Ned's horse took one in the flank, shrieking in pain, but continued a few more yards before it stumbled. Ned rolled free, hitting the ground hard, teeth rattling. He struggled to stand, ignoring the throbbing ache in his leg and side. A wave of Crown knights thundered past him, smashing into the hastily arranged Dornish lines. Screams tore through the dusty air. Ned limped forward, sword in hand, scanning for any sign of Oberyn Martell or Doran. The men ahead were locked in a swirling melee. He recognized some Dornish lords' banners: Gargalen, Ironwood, Santagar, but not the sun and spear of the main Martell retinue. Over the din of battle, he heard the ring of steel, the cries of war. Step by step, he pressed onward, shield up, parrying a wild blow from a Dornish footman who lunged at him. He returned the strike, his sword biting into the man's collarbone. The footman collapsed, and Ned pushed past, heart hammering with adrenaline and horror. Suddenly, a shape burst from the chaos. A tall man in dark leather, spear in hand. His face was lined, his hair shot with gray, but he moved with coiled speed. Ned recognized him from descriptions. Oberyn Martell, the Red Viper. Their eyes locked. Oberyn snarled, leveling his spear. "Here you are, Wolf King. Come to finish what your precious Lannisters started when they butchered my kin." Ned struggled to catch his breath. "I had no part in Elia's murder. That was Tywin's doing." Yet he knew it would fall on deaf ears. Dorne had not forgotten the Crown's complicity, or Robert's acceptance of Tywin's bloody gift. Oberyn's spear lashed out in a lightning thrust. Ned barely deflected it with his shield, feeling the jarring impact as the spear's tip gouged the thick wood. Oberyn twisted the spear, ripping the shield apart with surprising strength, then pivoted for another strike. Ned sidestepped, attempting a slash at Oberyn's flank, but the Dornish prince was quick, spinning away and striking again. The spear point grazed Ned's gauntlet, cutting through the metal to slice flesh. He hissed in pain, but forced himself to hold his sword. Another thrust came. Ned ducked, the spear whistling over his head, then lunged in a riposte. Their weapons clashed, echoing in the swirl of battle. Around them, the fighting raged. Oberyn moved with fluid grace, each strike testing Ned's defenses. Ned felt the ache in his leg intensify. Stannis' old wound was flaring at the worst time. He grimaced, trying to keep his guard up. Oberyn's face shone with sweat and fury. "Your new realm is built on the bones of my people's pride," he spat. "You think we'd kneel to you after you murdered every other great family? We are not so weak." Ned managed to parry another thrust, stepping closer so Oberyn couldn't use the spear's length as effectively. He swung a hard blow aimed at Oberyn's ribs, but Oberyn twisted, letting the sword's edge skim off his leather armor. Oberyn responded with a snapping thrust that hammered into Ned's side, denting his breastplate and driving the air from his lungs. Ned staggered, gasping. The world spun. He swung desperately to keep Oberyn back, but the Dornishman whirled behind him, slamming the butt of the spear into Ned's back. Ned fell to a knee, vision darkening at the edges. A triumphant snarl escaped Oberyn's lips. He raised his spear for the killing blow. "Die, Wolf King. This is for Elia." But before he could strike, a figure crashed into him from the side. A northern knight with a battered helm, sword swinging. Oberyn hissed, turning to parry the new threat. Ned seized the moment to surge up, ignoring the pain in his side, and slash at Oberyn's legs. Oberyn leapt back in alarm, but not quite fast enough. Ned's sword bit into his thigh, drawing a spray of blood. The Red Viper cried out, staggering. Another blow from the northern knight forced Oberyn to block high, leaving his flank exposed. Ned drove his sword forward, piercing Oberyn just below the ribs, where the leather parted. A shocked gasp choked out of Oberyn's mouth. His spear slipped from his hand, clattering on the stony ground. Oberyn collapsed to his knees, blood spilling from the wound. His eyes blazed with hatred. You kill me as you killed them all," he rasped, spitting blood. "Martell, Greyjoy, Baratheon, all your enemies. You're just another tyrant." Ned's sword arm trembled, a swirl of regret and necessity in his mind. He recalled the man's vow of vengeance, the entire tragedy of Elia and her children. He saw in Oberyn's eyes the reflection of all the wars that had brought them to this pass. But there was no turning back. He twisted the blade free. Oberyn slumped sideways, breath rattling, life pouring out onto the sand. Ned swayed, feeling faint from the spear's blow to his ribs. The northern knight who had intervened clutched his arm, steadying him. "Your Grace, are you hurt?" the knight asked, voice muffled behind his dented visor. Ned coughed, nodding. "I'll live." He stared at Oberyn's still form, a swirl of emotions roiling in his chest. Relief that the immediate threat was ended, guilt at yet another death that might drive the Dornish to deeper hatred. But this was war. Already, the Dornish lines around them were faltering, the news of Oberyn's fall spreading. Some tried to fight on, but others threw down spears or fled. The crown forces closed in, hammering away until the pass belonged to them. By late afternoon, the Dornish army was broken. Many were dead, others captured or scattered into the desert. The pass lay open, a route into the heart of Dorne. A messenger arrived with news that a second group of crown forces had circled the mountains, pressing from the other side. The Dornish had nowhere to run in large numbers. Prince Doran was rumored to be at Sunspear, with only a small garrison. The conquest of Dorne seemed all but assured. As Ned lay in a makeshift command tent, letting a maester dress the wound in his ribs, he pondered the cost. Another region subdued, another proud house broken. His men whispered that the Red Viper was dead, that Dorne's spirit might be broken for good. Perhaps it was, but he wondered if the hate seated here, among the battered survivors, would one day sprout again, or if the realm, at last, might find a final peace under Stark dominion. When he was able to walk again, he led the main army onward, deeper into Dorne. Village after village either surrendered on sight or lay abandoned. The desert wind carried dust across the roads, stinging men's eyes, parching their throats. Occasionally, bands of Dornish partisans attempted ambushes, but they lacked the numbers to stand against the crown's might. One by one, small holdfasts opened their gates. Ned's men placed loyal castellans to keep order. Strict orders were given to prevent looting or abuse of the local populace, though inevitably, some outrages occurred. War made beasts of men. Ned tried to keep discipline, but he could not be everywhere at once. The realm would add these crimes to its ledger of resentments. At last, after several weeks of trudging through the harsh Dornish terrain, they caught sight of Sunspear rising from the horizon, spires reflecting the scorching sunlight. The famed seat of House Martell stood near the sea, ringed by tall walls and the azure waters of the summer sea beyond. Ned's forces encamped in a wide arc around the city, setting up siege lines, catapults, and watchtowers. Yet by now, the Dornish had little hope. Their main army was shattered, Oberyn slain. Prince Doran was rumored to be ill or in despair. Some said he was prepared to surrender rather than see Sunspear burn. Negotiations commenced at the city gates. This time, no arrogant messenger challenged them. Instead, a servant in Martell colors approached, eyes downcast, delivering a sealed letter from Prince Doran. The letter read that Doran, acknowledging the inevitability of defeat, would surrender Sunspear and yield to the crown if Ned Stark promised mercy for Dorne's smallfolk and did not raise the city. House Martell's leadership would be placed under arrest, subject to whatever punishment Ned decreed, but Doran asked for leniency for all those who had not directly participated in the rebellion. A last, desperate plea for the survival of his people. Ned closed his eyes in relief as he read it. He had no desire to catapult stones into Sunspear, to slaughter more innocents in the name of an unyielding conquest. He summoned his council. We accept Doran's surrender. Place him under guard, along with any Martell loyalists who refuse to swear fealty. The crown's men will occupy Sunspear and the rest of Dorne. Let there be no illusions. House Martell is outlawed. The next day, the gates of Sunspear were thrown open. Crown troops marched in, weapons drawn, expecting resistance. None came. The streets were eerily silent, the locals watching from shuttered windows. At the palace known as the Old Palace, Ned dismounted, leading a detachment of soldiers. Doran Martell awaited them inside, seated in a wicker chair draped with cushions, his legs swollen with gout. He looked older than Ned expected, his face lined with sorrow. Around him, a handful of Dornish nobles. Most looked terrified or furious. Doran raised his gaze as Ned approached. "It seems," Doran said softly, voice trembling, "that your wolf has devoured us all." There was no defiance left, only a sad resignation. "You have your victory. I only beg you to remember mercy." Ned gazed at him a long moment, remembering how many had pleaded for mercy in these wars. Men and women from the Westerlands, the Reach, the Stormlands. He had tried, always, to temper conquest with restraint, but the road was soaked in blood. "I will not burn Sunspear," he said at last, "nor will I punish those who had no hand in the rebellion. But House Martell is outlawed. You will be taken to King's Landing under guard, along with any who refuse to renounce Martell claims." A tear slid down Doran's cheek. "So ends centuries of pride," he murmured, voice ragged. "If my brother were alive, he would curse me for surrendering. But what choice have we?" Ned did not reply. He motioned to his guards, who moved to take Doran into custody. Nobles murmured in dismay. One or two made as if to draw steel, but the glint of dozens of crown blades and the memory of Oberyn's defeat stilled them. By nightfall, the banners of the direwolf flew over Sunspear. Dorne, the last holdout of major resistance, had fallen. Thus ended the last great house's open defiance. The realm, at least for the moment, was wholly under House Stark's iron rule. Yet as Ned stood on a balcony of the palace at dawn, gazing at the sun rising over the summer sea, he felt no elation, only a profound exhaustion. The entire realm lay at his feet, but it was a realm of shattered houses, suppressed rebellions, smoldering hatreds. He had promised an end to war, and at last, in the most brutal manner, he had accomplished it, or so it seemed. But the cost was unimaginable. The voice of his old friend Robert seemed to echo in the salt-tinged wind. "War is easier than peace, Ned. War is simpler. Peace is the real challenge." He turned from the window. The day's tasks awaited: finalizing the new administration of Dorne, dispersing loyal garrisons, preparing to escort Prince Doran and any Martell loyalists to King's Landing for trial or imprisonment. Another day of forging chains, of forcing the realm to remain subservient to the Wolf King. Did it achieve the peace he'd hoped for, or only buy time for new resentments to gather in the shadows? Ned returned to King's Landing weeks later, accompanied by lines of wagons bearing prisoners from the Dornish leadership. The small folk in the capital watched in a mixture of awe and fear as House Martell's final scions were carted through the streets, heads bowed, outraged or broken. Some spat at them, calling them traitors. Others spat at Ned's men, cursing the tyrant who had banished all the old houses. But no riots erupted. The city watch had tripled its presence, and a tangible oppression lingered. In the Red Keep's throne room, Ned sat on the Iron Throne, the ancient swords cold against his back. He pronounced sentence upon Prince Doran. Life imprisonment in the Red Keep cells, his property forfeit, his claim to Dorne revoked. The lesser Martell cousins who would not bend received the same or faced execution if they had actively fought. The rest of Dorne's lords, Ironwood, Dane, and others, would lose their old ties and be forced to accept direct oversight from crown-appointed governors. The same model Ned had imposed everywhere else. So it was decreed, final and absolute. A hush fell over the throne room after Ned spoke, as if the entire realm exhaled. The last great house had been outlawed. The Tyrells, the Lannisters, the Greyjoys, the Baratheons, the Martells, the Tullis, all of them had been stripped of power, undone by the Wolf King's relentless campaign. House Stark reigned alone, undisputed, unstoppable. The small folk might fear him, but they had little choice now. The great lords were either dead, imprisoned, or cowed. Peace, of a sort, descended. An uneasy hush that felt more like the quiet in the wake of a destructive storm than the healing calm after. That evening, Ned found Sansa and Arya in the gardens behind the keep, a walled enclosure where a few hardy rosebushes still survived. The sunset lit the sky with soft oranges and pinks. Arya was staring at a drooping rose, gently prodding it with her finger. Sansa stood close by, arms folded, eyes distant. Ned approached slowly. "You've returned," Sansa said, a tinge of relief and sorrow in her voice. "Will it never end, Father?" Arya turned, frowning. "Have we run out of people to fight now? Are we safe?" Ned swallowed, feeling their twin gazes upon him. He wanted to tell them yes, that the realm was at last safe, that no great house could threaten them anymore. But he could not ignore the shadows that lingered behind every glance in King's Landing, or the possibilities across the sea. Daenerys Targaryen might still exist, with her rumored dragons. In the north, the free folk might stir, or worse, something beyond the wall might come. Ned was haunted by the old words. Winter is coming. He had spent so much time taming the realm, he had hardly spared a thought for the cold threat from beyond the north. Yet he could not say that to his daughters. He knelt, placing a hand gently on Arya's shoulder. "I've done all that can be done to end the wars here. For now there is peace of a kind. I know it may not feel like the stories, but let us pray it will keep our people alive and safe." Arya stared at the ground, uncertain. Sansa placed a hand on Arya's arm, a rare gesture of sisterly unity. "I suppose we can only hope," she said softly. "So much has changed. Everyone speaks of the Wolf King with fear. I hear them whispering in corners, calling us usurpers and tyrants. I remember wanting to be queen someday, but not like this. Not with the entire realm cowering." Ned's throat tightened. He stood, pulling both daughters close for a moment, as he used to do when they were little. "It is not what I would have chosen either," he murmured, voice rough. "But sometimes we must make choices we never wanted, to prevent worse horrors." He felt Arya's breath hitch and Sansa's trembling. They had seen too much. His mind drifted to Bran and Rickon in Winterfell, to Robb managing the north. He wanted to bring them all together to make the family whole again. Perhaps that was the best step forward, some measure of normalcy. Yet he dreaded the day they would all understand the cost of his crown. As darkness fell, he left his daughters in the relative calm of the garden and went to his solar. There, Awaiting him was a raven from the citadel. It bore cryptic tidings of unnatural cold in the far north, rumors carried by the night's watch of strange sightings. Ned felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert or the capital's heat. He had neglected the North's deeper threat while embroiled in southern wars. Now the realm was subdued, but if the old tales were true, a greater danger might yet loom. He set the raven's message aside with a trembling hand. Tomorrow he would address it. Tonight he needed rest, or at least a moment's pause. The crown felt heavier than ever. In the weeks that followed, Ned tried to push forward a new era of reconstruction. He reissued edicts to feed the small folk, restore roads, and unify coinage under a single currency minted by the crown. He dispatched loyal lords to each corner of the realm with instructions to treat the people fairly, to foster trade and discourage the old vendettas. Many of those lords carried with them a fearsome reputation for punishing disloyalty, but Ned hoped they might also instill enough order to let the realm breathe. Gently, he tried to open new negotiations with the Ironborn, offering Asha Greyjoy a chance to prove her word. She remained guarded in the Red Keep, but her wounds had healed. If she could bring at least some of her people to kneel, the raids might cease. He considered that small success a critical step in ending all conflict. Some parts of Westeros showed signs of hope. With no great houses to pit them against one another, lesser lords who once bickered over trifling boundaries found themselves forced to abide by crown edicts. Trade caravans ventured forth again, albeit cautiously. Harvests in the Reach were coming in, ensuring the capital would not starve this winter. The river traffic on the Mander and the Trident slowly returned, even if it was now policed by stern crown officials. Smugglers and bandits were hunted relentlessly. A sense of tentative stability took root, overshadowed by the memory of the wars that had led here. Yet for all this show of a stabilized realm, Ned knew the seeds of hatred and resentment still lay buried. The lords of the Westerlands nursed grudges over the execution of Jaime Lannister and the ruin of House Lannister. The Tyrell bannermen resented the new order that had replaced the Golden Rose with the Direwolf. The Stormlands were hollow after the fall of Stannis. Dorne simmered, sullen and resentful at the loss of House Martell. The Ironborn were not yet fully subdued. And across the narrow sea, rumors of a Targaryen queen with living dragons might spark hope in exiles dreaming of vengeance. The realm was quiet, but not at peace in its soul. One night, Ned conferred with Maester Argrave in a small library. The shelves overflowed with dusty tomes, many dating back to Targaryen rule. The flickering candles cast their shadows on the walls. Argrave laid out a map of Westeros, detailing the new administrative divisions, sections of land assigned to crown-appointed stewards, each beholden directly to King's Landing. The map was full of lines and scribbled notes, a testament to how thoroughly they had redrawn the realm. "All the old allegiances are shattered," Argrave said, tapping the map. "You have replaced them with direct crown governance, each region administered by men who owe their titles to you alone. In theory, it should prevent another revolt. In practice, it's a fragile system that depends on fear and a steady supply of troops." Ned rubbed his brow. "I am painfully aware. The question is how to transition from forced obedience to genuine stability, if there is such a path." Argrave adjusted his spectacles, regarding Ned carefully. "It might take a generation or more for people to accept this new order. If they do at all, ideally you would show leniency and fairness, slowly building trust. Of course, that might allow some to exploit your mercy and plot anew." Ned exhaled heavily. "So either I remain a tyrant or risk letting conspiracies fester. There must be a middle ground. I have not done all this simply to reign by terror." Argrave gave a sympathetic tilt of his head. "It is a delicate balance, Your Grace. Perhaps you can hold a grand council, invite lesser lords from every region to speak, to propose how to best govern under your final authority. Involve them in the shaping of the new laws so they feel some investment. It might quell some resentments." Ned considered the suggestion. A grand council was an old tradition, though usually it involved the great houses, now non-existent. "I will think on it. If it can give them a voice without granting them the power to form a new rebellious bloc, it might help. But we must be wary of gathering too many lords in one place. Chaos could ensue. Argrave nodded. Yes, caution is wise, but shutting them out entirely will only breed more hatred. In the end, how you choose to rule in peacetime may determine if your legacy is one of reconstruction or unending oppression. The word struck Ned deeply. Reconstruction or oppression. That was the choice, wasn't it? He had used the sword to unify the realm. Now he needed something else, some guiding principle to build a future. He thought again of the North's words. Winter is coming, and perhaps the storms that lay ahead, from the far north or across the sea, could be more dangerous than any rebellious house. He had to ensure Westeros was strong enough, united enough to face those threats. If that meant loosening his grip, but not so much that the realm fell apart, he would attempt it. He set his jaw. Very well, Maester. Let us prepare for a great assembly of lords. We will see if we can forge a consensus. Argrave bowed. I will dispatch ravens at once. In the ensuing weeks, invitations went out to every corner of Westeros for a grand assembly in King's Landing. The reason was described as to shape the realm's future under a unified crown. Lesser lords, knights, town mayors, any figures of standing, were invited to attend and propose how the realm might be governed. The old system of great houses was gone, so Ned wanted to see if the lesser lords could form a new council or representative body under the crown. He envisioned a structure of governance that might allow for local autonomy without fracturing into warlords. A delicate experiment, one that might fail if old grudges flared again. Many lords were wary. Some came because they feared refusing the king's summons. Others came out of genuine hope they might restore some measure of normalcy, or at least secure better terms for their lands. By the time the appointed date arrived, the Red Keep's halls were thronged with new arrivals. Guard patrols doubled, ensuring no weapons were smuggled in. Paranoia ran high. The memories of the last few years' bloodshed were fresh. Ned opened the assembly in the throne room, though he avoided sitting on the Iron Throne for the proceedings, instead standing at a simple wooden dais. He was flanked by Ser Barristan and a handful of loyal knights. The lords gathered below in a murmur of voices, each uncertain how this would proceed. Ned raised a hand for silence. "My lords," he began, voice carrying, "we have ended the wars that plagued Westeros. The houses that once warred for supremacy are gone. The crown stands alone in authority. But I did not do this to see the land fall into ruin or fear. I summon you now to discuss how we might rebuild, how we might ensure stability and justice for generations to come." A few scattered nods, some applause, but mostly the crowd's response was uneasy. Many of these men had lost kin in Ned's wars. Still, they listened. One by one, smaller lords came forward with suggestions. The need for clear lines of inheritance so that no single family could again grow too powerful. The need for oversight committees to prevent abuses by local governors. The desire for lesser lords to have a voice in setting taxes. Some called for restitution of certain traditions, like local wardships or arranged marriages to tie families together. Others insisted that the crown must ban all alliances that could overshadow the monarchy. Ned tried to sift through the arguments, occasionally conferring with the maesters or advisors. He wanted to glean workable ideas, but each time a new lord spoke, he carried the weight of personal grudges or old disputes, complicating the conversation. The assembly threatened to devolve into bickering. Some demanded the right to raise private armies for local defense. Others insisted that only the crown should maintain armies to prevent another civil war. Over hours, tensions escalated. Ned often had to intervene, reminding them that the crown had the final say. More than once, angry lords nearly came to blows. The memory of the Wolf King's wrath, however, kept them from open violence. Days passed in similar fashion. Ned began to see that forging a new system out of the ashes of the old was far more complex than simply conquering rebellious houses. The small council drafted proposals, which the assembly debated. Tempers flared. Meanwhile, King's Landing was strained under the influx of visitors, some of whom brought retinues that tested the city's food supply and lodging. The City Watch worked tirelessly to prevent brawls in taverns or sabotage in the streets. During one particularly heated debate, A lord from the Westerlands accused a knight from the Reach of having pillaged his farmland during the recent war. The knight fired back that the Westerlands had first attacked the Reach, citing Lannister aggression. Shouts rose, men grabbed sword hilts. Ned had to stand, raising his voice in commanding anger. "Enough! The wars are over. We are here to build anew, not rekindle the flames. Any man who cannot keep his peace will be removed from this hall." His glare alone seemed to chill the worst offenders. They subsided, though muttering. Even so, progress was made, halting fragile progress. The assembly agreed that private armies should be limited, that local militias could be raised only with the crown's approval. The question of taxation was more complex. Many demanded reduced taxes after years of war, but the crown needed revenue to rebuild roads, fortifications, and feed the hungry. A compromise was reached. Taxes would be standardized across the realm, with each region paying a portion based on population and productivity, not on ancient tithes to a feudal overlord. It was a radical shift from the old ways, but it passed narrowly, thanks to Ned's firm stance and the presence of crown guards intimidating the waverers. On inheritance, the assembly decided that no lord's domain could exceed a certain size, preventing the rise of a new great house. If a lord gained too many lands by marriage or conquest, the crown would intervene to divide them. Ned endorsed this measure. It would keep anyone from becoming another Tywin Lannister or Mace Tyrell. Some objected that this was an overreach, punishing ambition, but the majority recognized that ambition had cost the realm dearly. In the evenings, Ned found himself drained by the endless debates and the raw hostility brimming under the surface. He confided in Catelyn, who had quietly observed many sessions from the sidelines. "They hate me," Ned said, sinking into a chair in their private solar. "They fear me, at least. I can see it in their eyes whenever I speak. And half of them resent each other almost as much. It's a wonder we've made any progress at all." Catelyn poured him a cup of wine, pressing it into his hands. "They do fear you, but fear alone cannot hold the realm together forever. This assembly is a start. A chance for them to speak, to see that you're not a demon thirsting for their blood. Show them firmness, but also that you value justice. Over time, it may ease the fear." He sipped the wine, feeling its warmth. "Justice," he echoed. "I used to believe in it so simply. Right and wrong, truth and honor. Now I see how it tangles with pride, with old wounds, with desperation. Sometimes it feels like an impossible knot." Catelyn laid a hand on his shoulder. "We do what we can. This is the time to plant seeds of understanding. Let them see a path forward that doesn't involve rebellion." He set the wine aside. "You speak truly, as always. Tomorrow we push on with the assembly, finalize the charter. If the realm accepts it, perhaps we can lighten the garrisons in certain places and shift resources to feed the small folk. Show them that this new order isn't all punishment and demands." He soon learned, though, that bridging the realm's wounds would not be so simple. During the final week of the assembly, a rumor broke out that Tyrion Lannister, long missing, presumed exiled, had been spotted in the city, meeting with certain disgruntled lords from the Westerlands. At once, alarm rippled through the Red Keep. Tyrion was a cunning foe, the last Lannister of real consequence. He might be stirring up a scheme to undermine Ned's new system. The Gold Cloaks launched a hunt through the city, rounding up suspicious foreigners, searching every inn and brothel. Yet no sign of Tyrion was found, only frightened bystanders. Ned worried that the rumor itself might be a ploy to sow chaos. Nonetheless, he tightened security around the assembly, fearing an assassination or sabotage. The tension soared. Lords muttered that the Wolf King was showing his true colors again, suspecting them of conspiracy. Spies filled the halls, eyes and ears pricked for any sign of a traitor. Many lords wanted to leave, to return to their lands, but Ned insisted they remain until the charter was approved. People began to speak of an invisible net, tangling them in House Stark's power. The mood grew more sour. Still, Ned pressed forward. At last, the assembly voted on the charter, which established a new administrative structure. Localized councils under crown-appointed overseers, uniform taxation, restrictions on the size of landholdings, and a prohibition on re-establishing any great house. Passed with a narrow majority. Many lords only relented out of fear that dissent might brand them rebels. The hush that followed was uneasy. Ned stood at the dais, ignoring the prickle of sweat on his brow, and declared the charter law. He reminded the gathering that the realm must stand as one if it hoped to avoid the horrors of the past. Applause was half-hearted, but the deed was done. In the aftermath, the lords departed King's Landing, returning to their regions. Ned hoped they would implement the charter's guidelines, building a stable foundation. Only time would tell if they truly would, or if the seeds of revolt might sprout anew. For a while, the capital quieted, though tensions simmered. With the realm's reorganization officially codified, Ned turned his gaze north, where the Night's Watch had repeatedly sent ravens warning of strange happenings beyond the wall. He felt a stir of old dread. Winter always comes, he told himself. He had spent years conquering the south, but what if the true threat lay in the cold darkness beyond the north? He consulted the new small council. Most were reluctant to believe in whites or White Walkers, but they could not ignore the Watch's pleas entirely. Ned decided to travel north personally to inspect the situation, to see his son Robb in Winterfell, and to ensure that the fortresses along the wall were prepared. He left Ser Barristan in charge at King's Landing, along with a garrison of trusted men. He brought along a modest escort, not a full army. He wanted to move quickly and avoid alarming the city. Just before he departed, he received word from Asha Greyjoy. She had successfully reached out to a handful of Ironborn captains. Some were willing to lay down arms in exchange for a measure of autonomy under her governance, so long as they could still sail and fish. Perhaps the Iron Islands might find a new path. It was a small sliver of hope. He left instructions to formalize that arrangement if it bore fruit, welcoming Asha to remain in King's Landing under watchful but respectful guard until she could prove her loyalty. She accepted with stoic resignation. Another piece on the board, but at least it was a step toward calm. Then Ned, accompanied by Catelyn, Sansa, and Arya, who wished to return north, departed King's Landing. They traveled the King's Road, passing the Trident, noting the changes in once familiar towns now under direct crown rule. Soldiers wearing Stark sigils manned toll stations. Fields recovered from war, though signs of burned homesteads still scarred the land. At Harrenhal, still a looming ruin, they found a small crown garrison preserving order. Farther north, the air turned cooler, the forests denser. Old memories pricked Ned's heart. The river crossing where Robert had first greeted him after the rebellion. The mileposts that once led to Riverrun. Now Tully banners were gone, replaced by the direwolf or lesser lord sigils paying homage to the crown. Eventually, they reached the Neck. The damp and marshy terrain made travel slow, but Ned felt an odd sense of relief crossing into the north at last. This was his homeland, the place where the old gods still whispered in the weirwoods. He could almost believe he had shed the burdens of kingship, returning to the role of Warden of the North, caretaker of Winterfell. But of course, he was still king, and that title hovered over him like a silent specter. When Winterfell's ancient walls came into view, Ned's heart clenched. He saw smoke rising from the chimneys, the watchtowers manned by men loyal to House Stark. His own house, not a forcibly subdued region. The gates opened, and Robb Stark emerged on horseback, flanked by a troop of northern riders. Behind him, the courtyard bustled with activity. Robb's face lit with a smile as he saw his father and mother and sisters arrive. He dismounted swiftly, striding forward to greet them. Ned embraced him, feeling the strength in his eldest son's arms. It had been too long. "Father," Robb said, relief in his voice, "the North is well. We've heard tidings of your victories in the South, the new charter. Is it truly done?" Ned managed a weary nod. "For now, yes. The lords have bent. The great houses are outlawed. A new order reigns. Still, it is fragile." Robb led them into the castle. The familiar sounds and sights enveloped Ned. The bustle of cooks in the kitchens, the clang of the smith's hammer, the cold stone corridors. Catelyn and the girls made their way inside to warm themselves, greeting Maester Luwin and the old staff. Ned, however, soon parted from them and headed to the Godswood. He felt drawn by a deep yearning to speak to the Heart Tree. The sky was gray, and a faint drizzle misted the air. The Godswood's canopy whispered overhead, leaves trembling. Ned walked the worn path to the Heart Tree, a towering sentinel with white bark and red leaves. His face was solemn, carved in ancient times. He sank to his knees before it, exhaling a long breath. For a moment, he let himself be simply Ned Stark, the man who once believed in quiet honor, who prayed to the old gods for guidance. He shut his eyes, letting the hush wrap around him. The swirling memories and regrets of war churned behind his eyelids. The heads that had rolled, the fields blackened by battle, the great houses ended under the might of House Stark. A wave of sorrow pressed on his chest. He whispered, scarcely audible, "Have I done right, old gods? Or have I become what I once despised? Will the realm find peace, or have I only sown more bitterness?" He half expected no answer. The old gods rarely spoke in words, yet the rustling of the leaves felt like a kind of presence, as if the very land was aware of him. A soft breeze caressed his face, carrying the scent of damp earth. He remembered that the north was older than any throne or crown. The cycle of seasons would continue, regardless of who ruled. Perhaps that was the only comfort. Life goes on, even after the swords have done their worst. Ned opened his eyes, seeing the Heart Tree's face weeping sap in slow, crimson tears. He let out a shuddering breath. "I will do better," he murmured. "I will try." He rose, leaning on the trunk for support. The drizzle had begun to turn into a light rain, pattering the leaves. He wiped a hand across his eyes, uncertain if the moisture there was from rain or from tears of his own. Then he made his way back toward the castle, where his family waited. Tomorrow he would ride to the wall to see what new threats might stir in the far north. The realm might yet face horrors from beyond. He had done what he must to unify Westeros, to ensure it would not break apart under that threat. Though the price had been high, perhaps that was the final purpose behind all his harsh measures. As he walked, the faint reflection of the old gods would linger in his mind, a place of quiet acceptance in the face of unrelenting time. In that silent acceptance, he thought he sensed the shape of his father's spirit, and Brandon's and Lyanna's. Once they had all prayed here, believing in a simpler notion of right and wrong. The realm was not simple, nor was it kind. But if it could survive the madness of war and the tyranny of ambition, perhaps it might survive the Wolf King's iron reign long enough to face any storms to come. At least he could hope, as the rain gathered in gentle rivulets beneath the ancient, watchful eyes of the Heart Tree. In the days that followed, Ned journeyed north with a smaller escort, leaving Catelyn and the girls in Winterfell. As he drew closer to the wall, the air grew colder, the sky slate gray. Talk of spring had long faded. Autumn was advanced, and true winter might be near. Snow flurries drifted across the roads, dusting the land in white. At Castle Black, the Night's Watch greeted him warily. Their Lord Commander, an aging man named Jeor Mormont, led him inside to speak near a crackling fire. There, Ned heard of sightings of undead creatures, wights that roamed at night in the haunted forest, the disappearances of rangers, and a sense of rising dread. A chill ran through Ned. He recalled the old stories, the legends of the Long Night. He thought of how all his efforts to subdue the South might be for naught if the White Walkers truly returned. The realm could crumble under a threat that cared nothing for crowns or houses. He resolved to send fresh men and supplies to the Watch, to fortify the wall as never before. He would use the newly unified realm to muster resources. If the White Walkers were real, Westeros would need every advantage. He gazed out from the top of the wall, wind biting his cheeks, the vast expanse of frozen wilderness before him. In that moment, he felt how small men were in the face of the true vastness of the world. They warred and killed over crowns and houses, while something ancient stirred in the cold darkness. If war came from the north, he would need all the unity he had forged, no matter how bloody the forging, to stand a chance. He prayed the realm would rally, even with fear and resentment in its heart, for the sake of survival. Standing atop that colossal barrier of ice, Ned Stark, the Wolf King who had outlawed every great house but his own, thought of all the ruin left behind. Yet perhaps this was the reason for it all, to create a realm that, however fractured and fearful, could still unite against the nightmares from beyond. His breath steamed in the freezing air. Winter was coming truly now. He only hoped the realm he had claimed, by every harsh measure, would prove strong enough to endure. He turned from the edge, cloak whipping in the wind, and began the long descent, determined to do what he must, as he always had. There was no turning back from the blood that had already been spilled. He could only move forward, forging a future out of the shattered remains of the past, praying that in the end, Westeros would survive the coming of winter, and that the sacrifices made, no matter how grim, would not be in vain.